Hello, and welcome to Brada Tales. Tonight, we're bringing you a selection of eerie stories paired with the soothing sound of rain to help you relax and drift off to sleep. Before diving into the atmosphere of suspense, leave a comment below letting us know where you're watching from and what time it is. If these stories send chills down your spine, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. Get comfortable, let the fear gradually envelop you, and tell us what kind of stories you'd like to hear next time. Settle in, we're about to begin. Blood Chapel in Tennessee. It was a humid September evening when I arrived in Tennessee, drawn not by the bright lights of the cities, but by the shadows that clung to the forgotten corners of this state. A few weeks ago, I had come across a local legend while researching strange occurrences in rural America, the Blood Chapel. The story seemed simple enough: an abandoned chapel, lost to time, and a string of inexplicable disappearances linked to it. But as I drove through the winding roads, the weight of isolation began to sink in. The woods surrounding the highway seemed alive, watching me, though I was the only one on the road. I had come here for answers, maybe to debunk the myths or, at the very least, satisfy my curiosity. After all, I was used to hearing tall tales from small towns, stories that disappeared the moment you tried to follow up on them. But this one, it felt different. Something about it gnawed at me, even as I found my way into the town where the chapel was said to be hidden. I stopped at a small diner in the center of town, its neon sign flickering as if reluctant to admit its age. As I walked in, the silence was oppressive, broken only by the soft hum of a refrigerator in the corner. The few patrons seated at the bar didn't look up when I entered. I took a seat at the counter, trying to ignore the eerie stillness that hung in the air. I could hear snippets of conversation, but nothing about the chapel until the old man behind the counter spoke. He had the kind of voice that seemed to carry the weight of decades, the drawl that suggested he had seen more than he cared to remember. "You here for the chapel?" he asked, not bothering to glance at me as he wiped down a glass. I nodded, though I hadn't spoken a word yet. His eyes, now meeting mine, were dark and weathered, as though he'd stared into the heart of some old nightmare and never quite left it behind. "Don't go near it," he muttered, his voice dropping. "People around here don't talk about it for a reason." The hairs on the back of my neck stood up, and I found myself leaning in, almost against my will. "Why?" I asked, my voice quieter than I intended. The man's lips twitched as though he were suppressing something, fear, maybe, or a warning. "Some things don't stay buried, son. That place, it's got a history. And a grip on anyone foolish enough to mess with it." The way he said it made me uneasy. But it was the kind of unease that intrigued me. I had always been drawn to the darker side of history, to the places that people were too afraid to approach. Maybe it was the challenge, or maybe it was the unknown that made me want to dig deeper. "Where is it?" I asked, my curiosity piqued. The old man finally looked up, his expression unreadable. He seemed to measure me for a long moment before he spoke. "Head west. Keep going until you hit the edge of the woods. You'll know it when you see it. But mark my words, don't stay too long. Something about that place, it changes you." I didn't know if he was warning me or if he was trying to scare me off, but the feeling of being watched crept over me again. I paid for my coffee and left, my mind already racing with questions I couldn't answer yet. I wasn't sure what awaited me at the chapel, but I had a sense that, by the time I found it, there would be no turning back. The road stretched ahead, a narrow, winding path framed by dense woods that seemed to swallow the light. The sun was dipping behind the trees, casting long shadows across the cracked asphalt. The air was thick with humidity, and a damp, earthy scent clung to everything, as though the land itself was holding its breath. As I drove westward, the landscape slowly shifted from the sleepy town into the wilderness. I could feel the weight of isolation pressing down, and the few houses I passed seemed distant and forgotten, their porches empty, their windows dark. The silence was unnerving, a sharp contrast to the bustling world I was used to. The further I drove, the more I noticed how the people in this area seemed to avoid eye contact, as if there were an unspoken rule about not acknowledging anything that had to do with the chapel. At a small gas station just before the woods, I stopped to top off my tank. The attendant, a young woman with a nervous twitch in her eye, barely said a word. When I asked about the chapel, her face went pale, and she looked away, quickly changing the subject. "That's not a place you want to go," she muttered, her voice barely above a whisper. Her fingers fumbled with the pump handle, and she cast furtive glances at the road, as if expecting someone to overhear. I pressed further. "I'm just trying to find out more about it," I said, trying to sound casual. "Is it just a rumor?" She looked at me now, her eyes wide, full of something I couldn't quite place, fear, perhaps, or something darker. "It's not a rumor," she replied, her voice trembling. "People go missing. And those who come back, they're never the same." She seemed to realize how much she had said, her expression hardening. "Just forget about it. It's not worth it." But her words only fueled my curiosity. The more I encountered these reactions, the more it felt like something was being hidden from me, something that was too dangerous to know but impossible to ignore. I left the station with the vague sense that the entire town was complicit in keeping the chapel's secrets. The trees began to thicken as I turned onto a dirt road that veered off the main highway, my headlights cutting through the growing darkness. The air felt colder here, and an odd stillness hung in the atmosphere, as though the forest was holding its breath, waiting for something. I could hear the distant call of an owl, but otherwise, there was no sound, no rustling leaves, no buzzing insects. It felt as if the very land around me was holding back some terrible truth. The further I went, the more unsettling the landscape became. What had once been patches of farmland and scattered homes now gave way to thick, untamed woods. The trees towered overhead like silent sentinels, casting long, twisted shadows across the road. The feeling of being watched intensified, and the hairs on the back of my neck prickled. I looked in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see something, or someone, trailing me, but the road behind was empty, swallowed by the encroaching forest. As I drove deeper, I noticed signs of abandonment. A crumbling fence lined the road, its posts crooked and weathered by time. A rusted sign, barely legible, stood at the edge of the woods, warning, "Keep out." It was the only thing that seemed to acknowledge the presence of the chapel, but even it felt like an afterthought, neglected like everything else in this forgotten corner of the world. And then, through the trees, I saw it. The chapel stood in the distance, its silhouette dark against the twilight sky. It looked so out of place here, like a relic from another time, forgotten and forsaken by everyone except the land that had swallowed it whole. The roof was caved in, and the stone walls were cracked and weathered, covered in creeping vines. But even in its ruin, there was something imposing about it. Something wrong. As I parked the car at the edge of the woods, a chill ran through me. I hadn't expected to feel this unease, this weight of dread that seemed to hang in the air like a storm about to break. But as I stepped out of the car, the night air felt suddenly colder, the silence more suffocating. I glanced around, and for the first time, I understood why the townspeople avoided talking about this place. It wasn't just fear of the unknown, it was fear of what was known, but left unspoken. My footsteps crunched on the dry leaves as I made my way toward the chapel, but before I could take more than a few steps, I heard a sound behind me. A distant bell. Faint, but clear in the quiet of the night. It rang once, then twice. But the chapel's doors were tightly shut. And as I looked back at the darkening forest, I knew that this place had already begun to change me, even before I had set foot inside. The bell rang again, its sound sharp and clear in the oppressive silence of the woods. It echoed through the trees like a summons, a chill wind carrying the sound towards me, but there was no movement from the chapel. No sign of anyone. The heavy doors were shut tight, the windows dark and empty. I froze, my breath caught in my throat. For a moment, I questioned my sanity. The bell had come from inside, that much was undeniable. But how? The doors had been locked, the place abandoned for God knew how long. The wind was still. The forest was still. Everything seemed to be holding its breath, waiting for something. But there was no logical explanation for what I had just heard. Bells didn't ring by themselves, not in places like this, not in the dead of night. I turned back toward the car, briefly considering leaving. The air was thick with unease, the dark forest pressing in around me, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. But then, as quickly as the thought came, it faded. I had come all this way, and I wasn't going to turn back now. Not after everything the townspeople had said, after all the strange looks and whispered warnings. I took a deep breath, trying to steady my nerves. Get a grip, I muttered to myself. It's just the wind. Or maybe an animal. I was grasping at any explanation I could find, but I couldn't ignore the knot of dread forming in my stomach. It wasn't normal to hear a bell in a place like this, in the dead of night, when the rest of the world seemed so far away. I stepped closer to the chapel, my feet crunching the dry leaves beneath me. My eyes flicked to the door, half expecting to see it open on its own, but it remained just as still as the rest of the building. I reached out, my hand brushing against the cold stone of the chapel's wall. It felt solid, aged, but it wasn't the cold of stone that unsettled me. It was the emptiness around it, the quiet, the stillness. It was as if the building was waiting, anticipating something. I shook my head, trying to shake off the feeling of growing tension. I had to remind myself that there was an explanation. This couldn't be anything more than a trick of the mind, a product of the isolation, the dark, and the ominous stories I'd been fed. Maybe there was a loose piece of metal, an old mechanism in the bell tower, something that caused it to ring when the wind blew just right. It didn't make sense, but I needed it to. I couldn't allow myself to entertain the possibility that there was something supernatural at play here. Not yet. Another ring. This time it was louder, more insistent, reverberating in my chest. It rattled the air, breaking the silence like a crack of thunder. The sound seemed to come from inside the chapel, as if the bell itself was calling out to me. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up, and the weight of the darkness around me felt suffocating. I took a step back, my pulse quickening. Something wasn't right. No matter how much I tried to rationalize it, I couldn't deny the unease creeping over me. I glanced around, half expecting someone to be standing in the shadows, watching me. But there was nothing. Just the eerie quiet of the woods, the chapel, and the growing sense that I was not alone. I reached for my phone, hoping to distract myself, to prove that this could all be explained. The screen glowed faintly in the dark, and for a moment, I stared at the reflection of my face, the tension and doubt clear in my eyes. But when I looked up again, my heart skipped a beat. There, just beyond the chapel's door, was a shadow. It was a fleeting glimpse, just a shape, a figure moving behind the cracked windows, but it was enough. My breath hitched in my throat, and I stepped back instinctively, as though the figure might reach out and grab me. I tried to calm myself, telling myself it was just my mind playing tricks, but the logical explanations felt hollow. A cold shiver ran down my spine. With shaking hands, I turned and walked briskly back to my car, my mind racing. What had I just seen? Who, or what, was inside the chapel? I couldn't explain it. And the more I tried, the more the doubts gnawed at me. But no matter how much I wanted to dismiss the idea, a single thought lodged in my mind: the chapel was alive. It had been waiting for something, or someone. And now, it had me. I stood there for a long moment, frozen on the edge of the woods, my fingers gripping the door handle of the car. The shadows stretched across the forest floor like dark fingers, and the faint whisper of wind sent a chill through the air. I could feel the weight of the chapel's presence bearing down on me. It was as though the place itself had an invisible pull, a magnetic force that tugged at the deepest parts of my mind, urging me to come closer. Every instinct screamed at me to leave, to drive far away from this forsaken place and forget it ever existed. But my feet felt rooted to the ground. There was something in the air, something I couldn't explain. I kept thinking back to the stories I had heard, the warnings from the townspeople. Don't go near it. It changes you. But despite everything, I couldn't bring myself to turn away. The bell had rung again, almost like a call, a beckoning sound that lingered in my mind. It echoed in my head, a faint whisper that grew louder with each passing moment. My heart pounded in my chest, but my legs didn't move. I stood there, caught between fear and something else, an undeniable curiosity, an overpowering urge to discover what lay beyond the doors of the chapel. I took a deep breath and made my decision. This wasn't just a story. This wasn't just a local legend I had stumbled upon. This was something real, something tangible. The chapel was waiting for me. I couldn't turn back now. I walked towards the entrance, the gravel beneath my boots crunching like broken glass. The towering wooden doors loomed ahead, dark and weathered, with ancient iron hinges that creaked softly in the wind. There was no sound from inside, nothing to indicate that anyone was there. But I knew, with an unsettling certainty, that I was not alone. As I reached for the door, my fingers hesitated just for a moment. A sharp gust of wind swept through the trees, causing the chapel to groan softly, as though it were alive. My pulse quickened. I pushed the door open, the old wood creaking and groaning in protest, and stepped into the darkness beyond. The air inside the chapel was thick and heavy with the scent of mildew and decay. Dust floated in the dim light, filtering through the cracks in the stone walls. It was colder than I had anticipated, the temperature dropping suddenly as if the very atmosphere had shifted to something unnatural. The silence here was different. It wasn't the quiet of an abandoned building, it was the kind of silence that presses in on you, the kind that feels like it's waiting, watching. I could feel it then, the same pull I had felt earlier, but now it was stronger, more insistent. Something about this place made my skin prickle, my breath catch in my throat. I looked around, my eyes slowly adjusting to the darkness. The chapel was small, with stone walls that seemed to close in around me. The altar at the far end of the room was draped in tattered cloth, and a few broken pews lay scattered on the floor, as though they had been hastily abandoned. And there, at the center of it all, was the bell. It sat at the back of the chapel, perched on a crumbling pedestal. The bell itself was ancient, its surface worn and chipped with age. But it was the symbol carved into its side that caught my attention, a symbol I had seen before in the town's old records. the same one that had been mentioned in the stories. The mark of something ancient, something darker than history. I walked toward it, drawn by an unseen force. My mind screamed at me to turn back, to leave this cursed place behind, but my body refused to obey. The closer I got, the more the air seemed to press in on me, thickening with every step. And then, I saw it. A figure moved at the far end of the chapel, just beyond the altar. It was fleeting, almost like a shadow, but unmistakably human. It lingered in the darkness, watching me, waiting. I froze. My heart pounded in my chest as I tried to make sense of what I was seeing. Was it a person? Or something else entirely? The figure stepped into the light, and I could see it more clearly now. It was a man, dressed in black, his face obscured by the darkness of his hood. His presence sent a wave of cold dread through me. I wanted to scream, to run, but I couldn't move. I was rooted to the spot, held by that strange, magnetic force that had drawn me inside. The man didn't speak. He simply stood there, watching me with eyes that I could feel even though I couldn't see them. His presence was suffocating, oppressive, and I felt the weight of 1,000 unspoken words pressing down on me. I had come for answers, but I had found something far darker, far more dangerous than I had ever anticipated. The bell rang again, its sound reverberating through the chapel like the voice of something ancient, something beyond time. And I knew, in that moment, that I was no longer just a visitor. I had crossed a line. And whatever was waiting for me in this chapel would not let me leave so easily. I tried to steady my breath, but it came in ragged gasps, my chest tight with fear. The figure, whoever or whatever it was, remained motionless at the altar, its presence looming over me like a shadow that refused to leave. The chapel seemed to pulse with a strange energy, an undercurrent of dread that surged through the air with every heartbeat. Suddenly, the silence shattered. A soft, eerie scraping sound echoed through the chapel, as if something had been dragged across the stone floor. My eyes darted to the source, but the shadows clung to the corners, obscuring the origin. The sound grew louder, scraping, dragging, then a sharp clink that made my stomach lurch. I couldn't see it clearly, but I knew something was moving in the darkness, something just out of reach of my vision. I took a hesitant step forward, my feet moving like they were encased in lead, as though the very ground itself was resisting my presence. The scraping continued, then faded, replaced by a whispering sound, low, unintelligible, like voices chanting in unison. The words were foreign, distorted, their meaning slipping just out of my grasp. I swallowed hard, trying to force the rising panic down. This couldn't be real. The sound was just an echo, an illusion. But deep down, I knew something was wrong, that there was no logical explanation for the creeping unease that was tightening its grip on my mind. And then, as I stood there, rooted to the spot, a figure emerged from the farthest shadows near the chapel's entrance. It was a silhouette, barely more than a shape in the dim light. At first, I thought it was a trick of the eyes, a blur, a fleeting movement. But as the figure stepped closer, I realized it was more than that. It was human, or at least it appeared human, but something about its posture, its unnatural stillness, made it seem wrong, out of place. I couldn't make out any features, no clear lines, just an outline of a figure draped in dark robes that fluttered slightly in the still air. Its head was bowed, the hood obscuring its face, but I could feel its gaze, a presence that pressed against me like an invisible weight. My heart hammered in my chest as I backed up, inching towards the door, but the more I moved, the more figures appeared from the darkness. Dark silhouettes, no more than shapes, standing motionless at the edges of the chapel, like statues, like shadows. Their presence was suffocating. I blinked rapidly, trying to clear my vision, but when I opened my eyes again, they were closer. Inexplicably closer. One of them moved, a faint rustling sound like dry leaves scraping together. It took a step, and I could feel its attention shift toward me, an oppressive force that seemed to press down on my chest. Another figure followed suit, gliding soundlessly through the darkened space, their movements fluid, unnatural. They didn't speak, but the air around me seemed to grow heavier with every passing moment. I wanted to run. I needed to get out of there. But my legs refused to move. I was paralyzed, locked in place by the growing sense of something that I couldn't fully comprehend, but that I could feel creeping up from the depths of the chapel, rising like an insidious tide. Then, from the farthest corner, a new sound broke the stillness, soft, faint at first, but growing louder. It was the sound of bells, the same bell I had heard outside, but now it was as if the bell was coming from everywhere at once, its ringing echoing through the chapel's stone walls, reverberating in my very bones. The tone was different now, deeper, darker, distorted, as if it were calling out to me, beckoning me to come closer, to step further into its trap. My heart thudded painfully in my chest, but I couldn't tear my eyes away from the shadowed figures that stood just out of the edge of my sight. Their presence was almost hypnotic, drawing me in, forcing my attention, as if they were calling to me with some ancient, primal instinct. I tried to speak, but my voice caught in my throat. The air had thickened, and my words felt trapped, suffocated by the heavy silence that surrounded me. A voice broke through the tension, not one that came from the figures, but from somewhere deep within the chapel itself. The sound was low, guttural, and indistinct, like an ancient prayer being spoken in a forgotten tongue. It rose and fell in a rhythm, like the sound of chanting, but distorted, as if something far older and darker than any human voice had taken over the space. I couldn't see who, or what, was speaking, but I could feel the weight of the words pressing down on me, wrapping around my mind like tendrils, trying to force their way into my thoughts. The figures were moving again, drawing closer, and I could hear them now, the soft shuffle of their feet against the stone floor, the whisper of their robes brushing together. Their presence was overwhelming, suffocating, and the chapel seemed to close in around me, as if the walls themselves were shifting, narrowing the space between us. And in the middle of it all, the bell rang again. I couldn't breathe. I wanted to scream, to run, but my body refused to move. I was trapped, surrounded by darkness and shapes that I could barely comprehend. The chapel was alive, and it was waiting for something, waiting for me. The next morning, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being followed. It wasn't a presence I could see, but a weight that hung over me, like an unseen hand on my shoulder, always just behind me. Every time I glanced over my shoulder, there was nothing but the empty stretch of road, the dense trees lining the path back to the town. But the feeling lingered, gnawing at the edges of my thoughts, pressing against the back of my mind. I had barely slept that night, my mind replaying the events in the chapel over and over. The shadowed figures, the ringing bell, the chant echoing in the depths of the chapel. I kept asking myself the same question: what had I seen? What was that place? I couldn't ignore it. I couldn't just walk away from what I witnessed. It was as if something inside me had been awakened, and I needed answers, even if it meant facing whatever darkness lay hidden within the chapel. So, I decided to return. The drive back was quieter than I remembered, the roads empty and winding, the landscape stretching out in an endless sea of trees and mist. I tried to calm my racing thoughts, but every turn I took brought me closer to that cursed chapel, that place that felt both terrifying and magnetic. I wasn't sure what I was looking for, or even what I hoped to find. But deep down, I knew that the only way to put my mind at ease, if that was even possible now, was to go back. As I neared the chapel, a sense of dread washed over me. The air felt heavier now, like a storm was looming, but there was no sign of any clouds in the sky. The trees seemed to grow denser the closer I got, their branches twisted and gnarled, blocking out more and more of the sunlight. The chapel stood there, still as ever, its dark silhouette against the gray morning sky. I parked the car just outside the clearing, my hands shaking as I turned off the engine. The bell was silent now, and the eerie quiet that hung over the place felt even more oppressive than before. I couldn't explain it, but I felt as though the chapel was watching me, waiting for me to step forward. I took a deep breath and got out of the car, the cold air hitting my face, biting at my skin. Each step toward the chapel felt like a betrayal, like I was walking deeper into something that had no place in the world I knew. But I pressed on, my curiosity driving me forward even as my instincts screamed to turn back. The door was still closed, just as I had left it. The chapel looked the same, old, withered, its walls lined with creeping ivy and moss. But there was something new this time. Something that hadn't been there before. As I approached the front steps, my eyes caught a strange mark in the dirt. At first, I thought it was nothing more than an odd pattern left by the wind or animals, but as I knelt down to get a closer look, I saw that it was too precise to be random. It was a trail of footprints, but not like any footprints I'd ever seen. The prints were too deep, as if whatever had made them weighed far more than any human could. And the shape was wrong, almost elongated, too large for a person, with unnatural angles. It was as though something, or someone, had dragged its feet across the earth, leaving behind a trail that seemed to lead straight to the door of the chapel. A cold shiver ran down my spine. I hadn't noticed these when I had been here before, and yet they were unmistakable. They were fresh. Whoever, or whatever, had made these tracks was still here. I stood up, my breath caught in my throat, and turned my attention to the chapel door. It was still closed, but now I couldn't shake the feeling that it was not just locked by metal. The door itself seemed to have a presence, a force that kept me from entering, but I didn't care. The marks in the dirt, the heavy silence, the unsettling pull of the place, it was all leading me here. I reached for the door handle, my fingers trembling, and pushed it open. The sound of the creaking hinges echoed in the stillness, and the musty air inside hit me with a rush. It was colder than I remembered, the air thick with dust and a faint, almost nauseating odor. The chapel was as dark as before, the shadows even deeper now, but the oppressive weight of the place felt different this time, more intense. I stepped inside, my feet making little noise against the warm floorboards. The space seemed empty, yet I could sense it, the same presence that had been here before. It hung in the air, like something waiting, something alive. I walked further in, my footsteps echoing through the vast emptiness. The altar was still at the far end, covered in layers of dust, the same tattered cloth draped over it like a shroud. And there, in the corner of my vision, was the bell, silent now, but somehow more menacing than before. But it wasn't the bell that drew my attention. It was the shadow in the farthest corner of the chapel, a figure that wasn't there before. My pulse quickened as I strained my eyes to focus. The figure was obscured by the darkness, standing motionless like the others, but this one felt different. There was something familiar about it, something I couldn't place. And then, just as I was about to step forward, I heard it. A soft sound, no louder than a whisper, but it cut through the silence like a knife. A voice. It wasn't a chant this time. It wasn't even words I could understand. It was a low murmur, almost a hum, as if the chapel itself were breathing. I froze, my mind racing. There was no one else here, I was sure of it. And yet, the presence in the chapel was undeniable. The walls felt like they were closing in, the air thick and stifling. I couldn't explain it, but I knew the chapel was alive, and it had been waiting for me. And this time, I wasn't sure I could leave without becoming a part of it. I stood in the dim silence of the chapel, the weight of the air pressing on me from all sides. My mind was still reeling from the odd sensation of being watched. The shadows clung to the walls, more suffocating than they had been before, and that whispering, that strange hum, it lingered in the corners of my mind, refusing to let go. But I couldn't stay frozen forever. I had to find something, anything, that would make sense of this madness. The chapel was ancient, that much was clear. It was as if time had stopped here, leaving everything coated in a layer of dust, untouched for years, if not centuries. As my eyes adjusted to the gloom, I noticed a small wooden cabinet near the altar, tucked away in the corner behind a rotting pew. It looked insignificant, but there was something about it that drew me in. I wasn't sure if it was the way it blended into the shadows or if it was the way the atmosphere seemed to shift around it, but I had to see what was inside. I approached the cabinet cautiously, the floor creaking beneath my feet, and pulled open one of its doors. Inside, there was nothing but a collection of old, weathered books, their spines cracked and faded. But one book in particular caught my eye. It was a thick, leather-bound journal, its pages yellowed and brittle with age. The cover was unmarked, but it felt heavy in my hands, as though it had been waiting for me. I took a seat on the floor, the journal resting on my lap, and slowly opened the first page. The handwriting inside was strange, bold, looping letters, written in ink that had begun to fade over time. It took me a moment to make sense of the words, but once I did, the unease that had been simmering in my chest flared into full-blown dread. The entries were dated, many of them going back over 100 years, describing rituals and prayers conducted by the priests who had once served in this chapel. The language was archaic, the meaning unclear, but there were several recurring themes, rituals to summon, to bind, to protect. There were references to ancient rites, ones that involved offerings, chanting, and something darker, something far more sinister. But it was the final entry that caught my breath in my throat. The bell tolls again. The ritual is incomplete. We cannot break the cycle. We are bound to this place, and so will all who come after us. The ritual must be carried out, or we will be lost in the dark. The shadows will consume all. My fingers trembled as I turned the pages, looking for more, anything that could shed light on the cryptic words. The entries spoke of an ongoing ritual, one that was never finished, one that had been passed down through the generations of priests who had come to serve in this chapel. A ritual that seemed to require more than just faith. There were mentions of sacrifices, both physical and spiritual, and a constant need to maintain the connection to whatever was lurking in the chapel's darkness. And then, I found it. A faded sketch of the chapel itself, drawn in ink, with a small figure standing in front of the altar. It was no ordinary figure, though. Its proportions were wrong, its limbs too long, the face hidden in shadow. Below the sketch, there was a line that made my blood run cold. The one who comes must become the vessel. I didn't know what to make of that. The words didn't make sense, but somehow they felt like a warning. I felt a knot tighten in my stomach, a deep unease spreading through me. It was as if the journal itself was alive, trying to pull me into its pages, to make me part of something that I couldn't understand. I closed the book with trembling hands, my thoughts racing. Whoever had written these words had been desperate, trapped in something they couldn't escape. The ritual wasn't just a relic of the past, It was something ongoing, something that was still alive, waiting for someone or something to complete it. My mind flashed back to the figures I had seen the night before. Were they part of this ritual? Were they bound to this place, forever trapped in the cycle of whatever dark force had been unleashed here? I shuddered at the thought. I had to leave. I had to get away from this place, but something kept me rooted to the spot. The whispers were louder now, the hum in the air growing stronger, as if the chapel itself were aware of my presence, as if it knew I had uncovered something it had wanted to remain hidden. I took one last look at the journal, my hands still trembling. The entry about the vessel, it had to mean something. But what? And why had the bell rung when I entered? The door behind me creaked open suddenly, and I jumped, my heart leaping in my chest. The wind had shifted, and the outside air carried with it a faint, distant ringing, like a bell, distant but clear, calling me to listen. I didn't want to hear it. I didn't want to be pulled back into whatever this place was, but I couldn't ignore it. The darkness seemed to shift, closing in tighter, and I knew in that moment that I was no longer in control. Something in the chapel had already claimed me. The journal slipped from my fingers, landing with a soft thud on the cold, stone floor. And the bell rang again. I stood motionless, the echo of the bell still ringing faintly in my ears as the wind outside howled through the cracked windows of the chapel. The journal lay forgotten on the floor, but the weight of the words I had read still pressed heavily on me. The shadows seemed to stretch, curling and twisting in unnatural ways, as if they were reaching out for me. The air felt charged, electric, heavy with something I couldn't name. I had to find more. There had to be something else, some clue that would explain all of this. My mind raced, jumping from one thought to the next, but the feeling of dread only grew stronger. The chapel was hiding something, and I wasn't sure I was ready to uncover it. But there was no turning back now. I began to search the room, my eyes scanning every corner. The altar was the focal point, its age and neglect speaking of years of abandonment, but I needed to dig deeper. My heart thudded in my chest as I moved to the walls, tracing my fingers over the cracked plaster. There was something about the texture of the wall near the back that seemed off. It wasn't just dust and decay, it felt almost unnatural, as though the wall had been disturbed recently. I pressed my hand harder against it, feeling the cool surface. And then, there it was. A slight indentation, barely noticeable unless you were searching for it. With a low grunt, I pushed against the wall, and to my surprise, it shifted slightly, revealing a hidden compartment. A small wooden box sat nestled inside, covered in dust, but unmistakably out of place. My pulse quickened as I carefully pulled it free and set it down on the ground. The box creaked open with a groan, revealing a collection of strange objects inside. A handful of weathered vials, some sealed with old wax, their contents dark and indistinguishable. A small bundle of faded, yellowed paper, tightly wound, and a few other items I couldn't quite make out. But it was the objects surrounding them that caught my attention, several old, cracked business cards scattered about, their edges frayed with time. I picked up the first card, its black print faded but still legible. It read, Dr. Evelyn Harper, Psychic Investigator, P.O. Box 172, Mayville, TN. Uncover the truth behind the unseen. I stared at the card for a moment, my mind struggling to make sense of it. Dr. Evelyn Harper? A psychic investigator? What connection did she have to this place? Why would her card be hidden here, buried away inside this old chapel? I dug through the box, pulling out more cards, each one more disturbing than the last. Jonathan Keller. paranormal research specialist, Mayville Historical Society, connecting the past with the present, and another, Father Thomas W. Green, priest and exorcist, St. Michael's Cathedral, Knoxville, Tennessee, exorcisms and deliverance. Each card had a name, each one a link to someone who seemed to have investigated, studied, or worked in some way with the supernatural. But there was more. The final card, tucked at the very bottom of the box, was the one that made my stomach turn. It was a simple card, no name, just an address. 221 Bishop's Hollow Road, Mayville, TN. I could feel my heart skip a beat. I recognized that address. It was near the outskirts of town, a place I had driven past but never ventured close to. It was an area with a dark reputation. Locals whispered about it being a place of death and misfortune, though no one would ever say it directly. People avoided it, like they avoided the chapel, as if the very air around the place carried some kind of curse. I turned the card over, my hands shaking. There was something scribbled on the back, barely visible in faded ink. I could make out just a few words, and they sent a chill down my spine. Follow the path. The bell is the key. The words blurred before my eyes, but the meaning was clear. Whoever had left these cards had known what was going on here, had been involved in whatever had trapped this place in its sinister grip. And it seemed like they were all trying to uncover something, the same thing I was now desperately searching for. The bell was the key. I stood up abruptly, the cards slipping from my hands as I began to pace around the room, trying to think. My thoughts collided with one another, each new revelation building on the last, but all of them only deepening the mystery. What had happened to these people? Why were they investigating the chapel? What was the connection between them and the tragedies that had struck this town? The more I looked at the cards, the more I realized that each of these individuals had been tied to some kind of tragedy or unexplained event in the area. Dr. Evelyn Harper had been the one called when people started seeing things, people who spoke of ghostly figures in their homes, of whispers in the night. Jonathan Keller, from the Historical Society, had written about strange happenings tied to the town's founding, accidents, unexplained deaths, missing persons. And Father Green, the exorcist, had been involved in multiple cases of spiritual possession, many of them connected to places like this, places with a dark history. But they had all failed. They had come, they had tried to uncover the truth, and they had disappeared or left with broken spirits. And now, here I was, standing in the same place, holding the same cards, following in their footsteps. I felt like I was walking into something that I could not control, something that was much older and much more dangerous than I had ever imagined. The chapel was part of something much larger, something that stretched back generations. The bell, the ritual, the people who had come before me, they were all part of a cycle, a dark, unbreakable pattern that seemed to have no end. I looked down at the cards again. The path, the bell. I had no choice. I had to follow it. Even though every instinct screamed for me to leave, to run far away from this cursed place, I knew now that I had already crossed a line. There was no turning back. I picked up the last card, the one with the address, and stuffed it into my pocket. It was time to go. Time to find out what connection the chapel had to Bishop's Hollow Road. The bell rang again. I felt the chapel shift. It wasn't physical, at least, not in the way you'd expect. The walls didn't close in on me, nor did the floor crack open beneath my feet. But something in the air had changed. The silence was heavier now, more oppressive. The faint hum, that low buzz I had first heard when I stepped inside, had returned, almost imperceptibly. It was like a pulse, beating through the very fabric of the place. I could feel it pressing against my skin, like the chapel itself had become aware of me. Like it was watching me, waiting for me to make the wrong move. I glanced around the room, searching the familiar surroundings for something, anything, that would explain the creeping sensation that was beginning to take hold of me. I'd been here before. I knew every corner of this old building, but now it seemed different. The shadows no longer clung to the edges of the chapel. They had grown thicker, darker, as though they were slowly inching forward, curling around the room like living tendrils. I could hear my heartbeat in my ears, louder than the whispering wind outside. The air felt thick, thick with something unnatural, something that didn't belong here. A cold draft brushed against my neck, sending a shiver down my spine. It wasn't the kind of cold you'd expect from a decaying building. No, this felt deeper, colder, like the chill of an ancient grave, the kind of cold that settled deep in your bones and refused to leave. I stepped back toward the door, but before I could reach it, a low sound echoed from somewhere behind me, soft, barely audible at first, but unmistakable. It was a faint scraping, like the sound of something moving across stone. I froze. My breath hitched in my throat as I turned around, my eyes scanning the darkened corners of the chapel. There was nothing there. Just the dust, the shadows, and the silence that seemed to stretch on forever. But the feeling didn't leave. The scraping continued. This time, it was closer. And then came the footsteps. It wasn't a single set of steps, like someone was walking towards me. No. It was as if multiple people were moving through the chapel, slowly, deliberately, each footfall a heavy, uneven step, echoing through the space in a rhythm I couldn't quite understand. The sound filled the room, bouncing off the walls, reverberating in my chest, drowning out everything else. I turned in every direction, desperately searching for the source of the noise, but saw nothing. Just the same empty pews, the same cracked windows letting in the pale light. But I wasn't alone anymore. The bell rang again. But this time, it wasn't distant. It was right above me, louder, sharper. The sound of it pierced through the room, cutting through the tension like a blade. It was too close, too clear. The sound was coming from within the chapel itself, and I could feel the walls shaking with the force of it, as if the very foundation of the place was alive. My heart thudded painfully in my chest, and I stumbled backwards, trying to keep my footing as the floor beneath me groaned and shifted. The shadows seemed to stretch and writhe, curling tighter and tighter around me, as if the chapel was physically drawing me in. I reached for the door, my hand trembling as I grasped the cold brass handle. But just as my fingers touched it, the air shifted again. The bell stopped ringing, and the footsteps, now unmistakably behind me, halted as well. I stood frozen, the door still in my grasp, but something inside me told me I couldn't leave, not yet. The chapel, it was too quiet, too still. I turned slowly, my eyes scanning the room, searching for anything, any sign that I was still alone. That's when I saw it. A figure, standing motionless by the altar. Its silhouette was almost indistinguishable from the shadows, but there was something about it that made my breath catch in my throat. It was tall, impossibly tall, its limbs unnaturally elongated, stretching out like some distorted creature. The figure was shrouded in black, its body cloaked in what appeared to be dark robes, and its face was hidden in shadow. But I could feel its eyes on me, burning into me, even though I couldn't see them. I couldn't move. I couldn't breathe. I was rooted to the spot, my gaze locked on the figure, even though every part of me screamed to turn and run. The figure took a step forward, its movements unnervingly slow, deliberate, as though it was savoring every moment of my fear. And then, without making a sound, it disappeared into the shadows. But the chapel hadn't let go of me. I could feel it following me. I could feel the presence of something ancient and malevolent moving just out of sight, as though the chapel itself had become a living entity, a thing that fed on fear, on my fear. And no matter how much I tried to move, to escape, I knew it was only a matter of time before the walls closed in on me. I turned back to the door, my hand still gripping the handle, but before I could even turn it, the bell tolled once more. Louder. Closer. A voice, low and guttural, echoed from somewhere deep in the chapel, vibrating through my chest. You cannot leave. And with that, I knew. The chapel wasn't just a place. It was a prison. And I was its prisoner. The voice echoed in my mind, gnawing at my every thought. It wasn't a whisper, it was a presence, something deep, ancient, and suffocating. You cannot leave. I stumbled backward, my heart hammering against my ribs as the air thickened, growing colder and heavier with every passing second. The chapel felt alive, the walls closing in, the shadows stretching and pulling at me. The floor beneath me seemed to ripple, and for the first time, I noticed how distorted the space had become. The chapel no longer made sense. The aisles were too narrow, the ceiling too high, the windows, there were no windows. Just an endless, suffocating darkness. And then I saw it. It started with a flicker, just a flash of movement in the corner of my eye. I turned, but there was nothing there. No figure, no sound. Just the oppressive stillness of the chapel pressing down on me. My breath came in shallow gasps, my mind struggling to keep up with the nightmare I was trapped in. But then, the air shifted. A cold wind blew through the room, stronger than the draft from the cracks in the walls, and the shadows grew longer, stretching toward the altar. The air thickened with a strange, metallic scent, like blood, a smell so real I could almost taste it on the back of my throat. And then, they appeared. The first one was a woman, her face pale and twisted in agony, her eyes wide with terror. Her body was bound to a stone slab, blood dripping from her outstretched arms, her mouth open in a silent scream. She didn't move, but her eyes followed me, burning into me with an intensity that made my skin crawl. The scene flickered, like an old film reel, and then another figure appeared beside her, this one a man, his face frozen in a grimace of pain, his hands bound just like hers, his legs twisted at unnatural angles. Blood pooled around them both, staining the stone floor beneath them. But it wasn't just the blood that made my stomach lurch. It was the way they were trapped. Their bodies didn't move, but their eyes, those hollow, desperate eyes, kept watching me, pleading with me. I gasped, my body trembling, but the scene didn't stop. Another flicker. Another figure. Another victim. And then another. They were everywhere. The chapel had become a graveyard, a haunting gallery of souls forever trapped in torment. Figures appeared in every corner of the room, each one bound, each one marked by some unspeakable ritual. I could feel them, even though I didn't want to. Their eyes, hollow and desperate, all staring at me, pulling me in. You cannot leave. The voice was back, louder now, filled with contempt, a deep, guttural growl that vibrated through my very bones. I turned and ran, my feet pounding against the cold stone floor as I tried to escape. I had to get out, I had to leave, but the chapel was changing. The door, once so close, was now impossibly far away. Each step I took, the walls seemed to stretch, pulling the exit further into the distance. It was like the chapel itself was moving with me, folding in on itself, trapping me in its endless maze of stone and shadow. The path to the door twisted. The aisles I had walked through just moments ago no longer made sense. It was like I was running in circles, my footsteps echoing in an empty void. No matter how fast I moved, the exit seemed to pull further out of reach. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't think. My legs burned, my chest felt like it was about to collapse under the weight of the air pressing down on me, but I kept running, pushing through the endless corridors of stone that seemed to shift and change with every turn. I looked behind me, my breath catching in my throat. The figures, the victims, were following me now. They moved slowly, dragging their broken bodies toward me, their eyes still fixed on me with that same desperate, accusing stare. They were part of the chapel, and the chapel was part of them. They were the echoes of the past, and they wouldn't let me leave. I tried to scream, but my voice was swallowed by the silence. No matter how hard I ran, I couldn't escape them. The bell, that terrible bell, rang again, louder now, as if mocking me, pushing me deeper into the nightmare. You cannot leave. I reached the door. No, not the door. It was a wall now, a solid stone barrier where the exit had once been. My hand slammed against the cold surface, my knuckles scraping as I tried to force it open, but there was nothing. The chapel had swallowed me whole, and it was keeping me here. Forever. I spun around, panicked, desperate, but there was no way out. No way back. The chapel had become my prison, and I was trapped inside it, surrounded by the ghosts of those who had come before me, those who had tried and failed to escape. And then, from the corner of my eye, I saw him. The tall figure, the one I had glimpsed before, standing motionless in the shadows. He was watching me, his form more distinct now, but still shrouded in darkness. He didn't move. He didn't speak. He just stared, and his eyes, those eyes, burned with an intensity that seemed to pierce right through me. I wanted to run. I wanted to hide. But I knew that there was nowhere to go. The chapel was everywhere. The bell was everywhere. The darkness was everywhere. You cannot leave. The words repeated in my mind, an unshakable truth that I now understood. The chapel wasn't just a building. It was a place of imprisonment, a place where souls were trapped, bound to the rituals that had been performed here for centuries. And now, I was one of them. I had become part of the darkness. The night hung heavy over Tennessee, thick with an unnatural stillness. The stars above were hidden behind a blanket of clouds, leaving the world beneath them shrouded in shadow. I stood at the edge of the chapel's steps, my heart pounding as I stared at the darkened silhouette before me. The building seemed even more oppressive in the dead of night, its stone walls looming like a watchful giant, waiting. I had to go back. I had to know what was happening inside. The visions, the voices, the feeling that the chapel was alive, none of it made sense, but something in me refused to let go. Something twisted in my gut, urging me to uncover whatever secret it was hiding. And tonight felt different. There was no mistaking it. The chapel was calling me again. The wind stirred the trees around me, their branches creaking like old bones, but the air was unusually warm. Almost suffocating. I could feel the pressure building in my chest, as if the very air I breathed was charged with something dark. I hesitated for a moment, my fingers gripping the worn wooden door handle, the cold metal of the key in my other hand. The locals had warned me, told me not to come back, but what choice did I have? I had already seen too much. I had to face whatever was lurking inside, or it would haunt me forever. With a deep breath, I pushed the door open. The hinges creaked, a long, drawn-out groan that echoed into the night. The scent of old wood and dampness filled my nostrils as I stepped across the threshold, the warmth of the outside air suddenly replaced by a chill that sank deep into my bones. The chapel was silent, eerily so, but there was something beneath that silence, something stirring just out of reach. I took a step forward, the wooden floorboards creaking beneath my weight. The faintest rustle echoed in the distance, too soft to pinpoint, but enough to set my nerves on edge. I stopped and listened. The sound came again, sharper this time, like a soft whisper. It was coming from the altar, I was sure of it. I crept forward, the darkness wrapping around me like a shroud. My eyes strained to make out shapes in the gloom, but everything remained a blur, the air heavy and thick with the smell of decay. There was no moonlight to guide me, no faint flicker of light from the windows. Only the oppressive darkness, like the chapel had swallowed the world outside. And then, I heard it again. A scraping. Not just any scrape, but the unmistakable sound of something, or someone, dragging across the stone floor. It was slow, deliberate, like something heavy and lifeless was being moved, inch by inch. I froze, the sound slicing through the air, filling the space with an unsettling weight. I forced myself to take another step, my pulse quickening with every inch I moved. The scraping sound grew louder, closer, until I could hear it directly ahead of me. It was coming from the altar. I was almost there. Just a few more steps. But then, something else caught my ear. A low, almost imperceptible whispering. It was coming from behind me, soft and disembodied, like voices carried by the wind. I spun around, my breath caught in my throat, but there was nothing there. Only shadows. The whispers grew louder, though, more distinct now. I could make out a few words, but they weren't in English. The language was foreign, ancient, perhaps. It sent a shiver down my spine, as if I was hearing something I was never meant to hear. I turned back toward the altar, the whispers still lingering in my ears. The scraping sound had stopped, and in its place was an eerie silence that hung in the air like an omen. My hands trembled as I reached for the candle I had brought with me, lighting it with a flickering flame. The dim light cast long, wavering shadows along the walls, but it did little to penetrate the depth of the darkness that clung to every corner of the room. I could feel it now, the weight of the chapel pressing down on me. The air felt thick and oppressive, like I was being watched, my every movement scrutinized by unseen eyes. My pulse quickened again, and I couldn't help but glance over my shoulder, half expecting to see something, someone, there. The whispers stopped, but the air didn't. The chapel was watching me, and something deep within its walls was moving. I felt it in my gut, a cold, slithering presence that seemed to pulse with the very heartbeat of the building. Without warning, the scraping sound returned. But this time, it was closer. Too close. I tried to steady my breathing, but my chest was tight, the air too thick to fill my lungs. Something was wrong here, deeply, fundamentally wrong. The chapel, this ancient, decaying structure, had been untouched for years, and I was starting to wonder if maybe, just maybe, it was meant to stay that way. I had thought that coming back would give me the answers I sought, but now, every step I took only seemed to drag me deeper into some unholy pit. I clenched my fists, trying to force my mind to clear. There had to be a logical explanation. A draft. The wind. Maybe even the old floorboards settling in the silence. I tried to tell myself that. I had to tell myself that, or I would lose my mind. But deep down, I knew better. It wasn't the wind. It wasn't the floorboards. It was something else. Something far older, far darker. Something that didn't want me here. I took another step, the flickering candlelight casting grotesque shadows along the walls. The longer I stood in this place, the more I felt the chapel close in around me, like the walls were slowly tightening, cutting off my escape. I glanced toward the door, the one I had so confidently entered through only moments ago. It seemed so far now, so unreachable. Who else had been in here? Who else had stepped through these doors in the last, how many years? Decades? The locals had made it clear that no one ventured near this place anymore. There were rumors, whispers of things that happened in the chapel long before I ever set foot in this town. They said it was cursed, abandoned, left to rot. They weren't wrong. And yet, here I was, standing in the heart of that darkness, determined to uncover its secrets. But what if the secrets weren't meant to be uncovered? I felt my heart rate spike. Was I really ready for this? I was so sure when I arrived, so certain that my curiosity would guide me, lead me to something real, something I could explain. But now, I wasn't sure anymore. The doubts crept in, sinking like cold fingers into my mind. I forced myself to take another breath, to push away the rising panic. I could leave, just walk out, and never come back. That thought crossed my mind with such force that I nearly acted on it. But the memory of those figures, the blood, the voices, stopped me cold. No, I couldn't leave. Not without knowing what was going on here. Not without understanding why this place had such a grip on me. The fear gnawed at me, yes, but there was something more. Something darker, more insidious. I didn't just want to know what was happening. I needed to know. But I knew, too, that once I had those answers, I might not be able to unlearn them. This place had been abandoned for years, the floor rotting, the air thick with mildew and dust. And yet, the chapel felt alive. Alive in a way that no human structure should be. I could feel it in my bones, this gnawing presence, like it was watching me, waiting for me to make the wrong move. And I had already made that wrong move the moment I stepped inside. I closed my eyes for a moment, letting the stillness press in around me. I could hear my own breath, shallow and quick, as if my body had already accepted the fact that it wasn't in control anymore. I could feel the weight of the darkness, heavy and suffocating, the silence broken only by that haunting scraping sound, which seemed to draw nearer with every passing second. Why had no one come here? The townspeople's avoidance, their fear, it wasn't just some old superstition, was it? No, they knew something. They had to know. They didn't enter these doors for a reason, and here I was, standing in the heart of it, convinced I could solve the puzzle. But what if there was no solution? What if the chapel was meant to be left alone, buried in the past? I tried to shake the thought, to push it out of my mind. I couldn't afford to think like that. I wasn't some helpless victim, I was the one in control. I had come here to uncover the truth, and I would. I had to. There was no turning back now. But even as I tried to convince myself, I could feel the truth creeping in, curling its fingers around my mind. I was no longer just a curious visitor, a seeker of knowledge. I was part of this place now. Whatever had happened here before was happening to me, too. And I didn't know how to stop it. As the scraping sound grew louder, I gripped the candle tighter, my hand shaking. My throat was dry, my stomach twisted in knots, and the walls themselves, seemed to move, shifting in ways that defied all reason. I wasn't sure where I was anymore, if I was still in the chapel, or if I was slowly being pulled into something else entirely. A part of me wanted to run, to flee into the night and never look back. But I knew I couldn't. I had come this far, and now I had to face whatever it was that lay hidden in the darkness. The air in the chapel thickened, the shadows pressing closer as I took another step toward the altar. The scraping had stopped, but the silence had become unbearable, like a weight pushing down on my chest, making each breath a struggle. The dim light from the candle flickered violently, casting long, erratic shadows on the walls. It felt as though the very chapel was breathing with me, as though it was aware of my presence, and it did not welcome me. I tried to steady myself, but my body betrayed me. My legs were unsteady, and my heart hammered so loudly I could hear it in my ears. The floor creaked beneath my weight, every sound amplified in the oppressive quiet. I was moving toward the altar, but I could barely see past the faint glow of the candle. The darkness here seemed endless, like the shadows themselves were alive, reaching out to pull me deeper into the unknown. And then, I saw them. At first, it was just a flicker in the corner of my eye, something that didn't seem right. I stopped in my tracks, my breath caught in my throat, straining to catch any movement in the thick blackness. The air around me seemed to shift, a subtle distortion that sent a cold shiver down my spine. There, in the farthest corner of the chapel, standing just beyond the reach of the candlelight, were figures. Tall, imposing, draped in black robes that seemed to absorb the light. Their forms were indistinct, like silhouettes that bled into the surrounding darkness. For a moment, they were still, unmoving. But as my gaze focused on them, I realized they weren't just standing. They were waiting. A slow, horrifying realization settled over me. They were watching me. And worse, they were waiting for me to move. My skin crawled at the thought. Were these the figures I had seen in my visions? The ones that had haunted my waking moments? The ones who had been performing that ritual, the one I couldn't fully understand? My hands shook, and I dropped the candle, the flame sputtering out as it hit the floor. I felt the cold sweep through me, and the chapel seemed to grow darker, the oppressive weight of the shadows pressing down. The figures remained motionless, but I could feel them now, their presence heavier, more intense. As though they were breathing, exhaling a slow, eerie rhythm, their very existence filling the space with a sense of dread that made my stomach twist. Then, without warning, they moved. It was so sudden that my heart leaped into my throat. The figures, there were at least 3 of them, maybe more, began to shift, their movements unnervingly smooth, as though they were floating rather than walking. Their dark robes swayed slightly as they turned toward the altar, as if drawn to some unseen force. Their steps were almost soundless, gliding across the floor like phantoms. I tried to step back, my feet stumbling in my panic, but my body felt heavy, rooted to the spot. I could feel the chapel tightening around me, the walls growing smaller with every passing second. My breath was shallow, my pulse frantic in my ears. The darkness pressed in from all sides, suffocating, and the figures, they didn't stop moving. They reached the altar, standing in a line, their forms completely indistinct now, swallowed by the blackness that enveloped them. There was a quiet hum in the air, a low vibration that seemed to resonate through the floorboards and up my spine, making the hairs on the back of my neck stand on end. Then, the ritual began. The figures raised their arms in unison, and I could feel a shift in the air, a tangible change that made the chapel seem alive in a way that was beyond human comprehension. Their movements were slow, deliberate, as though they were conducting some ancient, forgotten rite. The air grew heavy with a strange energy that pulsed around them, an energy that made my skin prickle with cold. I could feel their eyes. I knew they were watching me. But I couldn't see their faces, not clearly. All I could make out were the dark, hollow hoods of their robes, the spaces where their faces should have been. It was as if they had no faces, only the blackness inside. I tried to look away, but the sight was mesmerizing, drawing me in despite the overwhelming urge to run. Suddenly, one of the figures turned its head slightly, as if aware of my presence. My heart stopped. For a moment, it felt like time itself had paused, like the world had gone completely still. I could hear nothing but the erratic beat of my own heart thundering in my chest. But then, the figure, its movements slow and fluid, reached up, pulling back the hood of its robe. The face beneath was empty. A void. A black hole where a face should have been. No eyes, no mouth. Just darkness, stretching infinitely into nothingness. A wave of nausea hit me. I stumbled backward, my legs giving out beneath me, but I caught myself on the pew. The air felt thick with a presence that wasn't human, something ancient and vast that hung heavy in the chapel. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't think. I could only feel the darkness closing in, suffocating me. The figures, they were still moving. Their arms moved slowly, deliberately, as though performing the rituals of old, as though they were trapped in a cycle that never ended. I couldn't look away. I had to know what they were doing, even if it was the last thing I ever saw. And then, I heard the voice. It was a whisper, soft, but unmistakable, coming from the depths of the darkness itself. The words were not in any language I knew, but they felt familiar. They resonated with something deep within me, something buried in my subconscious. I couldn't understand it, but I knew I was being drawn into whatever this was. And there was no turning back now. The ritual unfolded before me like a nightmare that I couldn't escape, and with each passing second, the dread in my chest grew heavier, as if something was slowly crushing my heart. My legs trembled beneath me, but I couldn't tear my eyes away from the figures in black, no matter how much my body screamed to run. The figure who had revealed its empty face, that black void, raised its hands, and the others mirrored its movements. The silence in the chapel was overwhelming, but there was a strange hum, a resonance deep in the air, vibrating in my bones. It was a sound I couldn't hear, yet somehow, it felt like it was coming from everywhere, inside of me, around me, through me. Their hands moved in precise motions, as if orchestrating something ancient, something that had been forgotten by time and buried deep within the earth. I could feel the air shift as they moved. The very space around me seemed to bend in response to their actions, as if the chapel itself were participating in the ritual, complicit in its dark, unseen purpose. The figures began to chant, their voices a low, guttural murmur that reverberated in the walls. It was unintelligible, no language I had ever heard, but it had a rhythm, a pulse, that made my skin crawl. With each chant, the temperature seemed to drop, the air thickening like fog, crawling around me, cold and clammy, sinking into my skin. I felt a chill settle on my bones, deeper than any cold I had ever experienced. They were summoning something. I could feel it, the presence, growing in the air, thick and oppressive. My head spun as the figures moved with precision, their actions deliberate, as if they had been performing this same ritual for centuries, without deviation. Their robes swayed, but it wasn't just the movement of fabric, it was as though the robes themselves were alive, undulating with a dark energy, shifting with something beyond their control. I thought I saw something. No, I didn't see it, but I felt it. A presence, dark and vast, hovering just out of sight, lingering in the corners of the room. It was watching us, watching me. I wanted to scream, to flee, but I was frozen, rooted to the spot by an invisible force that gripped me tighter with every passing moment. One of the figures reached into its robes and pulled something out, a jagged, blackened stone covered in what looked like dry blood. It held it up, offering it to the dark void above. The others followed suit, each pulling out a similar stone. They didn't speak, but their movements were synchronized, the ritual taking shape with every gesture, every whispered word that seemed to slice through the air like a razor's edge. Then they lowered the stones, and as they did, a low rumble echoed through the chapel, deep from within the earth. I could feel it in my chest, vibrating through my ribs, sending shockwaves through the floorboards. It was as if the very foundation of the building were trembling, as though the chapel itself was alive and reacting to the energy that was being summoned. The air was thick, suffocating, and as the figures raised their hands again, the stones in their grasp began to glow, softly at first, then with increasing intensity. A dark light, swirling with shadows and tendrils of black smoke, poured from the stones, filling the air around them. The glow was wrong. It wasn't the glow of something alive, but the glow of something dead, something that should not have existed, something that didn't belong in this world. I stumbled backward, my heart racing, my pulse hammering in my throat. The figures paid no attention to me. They were lost in the ritual, their eyes still hidden beneath the dark hoods, their faces still nothing but shadows. But I knew, I understood. This wasn't just some ancient religious ceremony. It was something far darker, something that transcended belief, something that had no place in the world of the living. The stones in their hands seemed to pulse, each beat of the light sending waves of energy through the room. And then, without warning, the glow flared up, blinding, overwhelming, like a star had ignited in the heart of the chapel. The air around me was thick with the stench of decay, of something rotting beneath the surface of this world. The light was suffocating, pressing against my skin like 1,000 needles. And that's when I saw it. A shape, a figure, emerging from the darkness. It wasn't one of the rogue figures, it was something else, something far worse. The shape was enormous, its outline indistinct, a mass of shadows and twisting, shifting forms that seemed to writhe and change with every heartbeat. The figure was wrong. Its shape was monstrous, but not in the way that one could describe. It defied logic, defied reason. It was a presence that filled the chapel, filling the corners of the room, stretching into the walls. It felt ancient, older than the world itself. It was the thing they were summoning, the thing they had been waiting for. My breath caught in my throat. It was here. Whatever this thing was, it was here now, drawn into this world by their ritual. I didn't understand how. I couldn't, but I could feel it in my bones, could feel the wrongness of it. The figures dropped their hands, and the darkness began to recede. The light from the stones dimmed, and the presence withdrew, its form dissolving into the shadows like a dream fading at dawn. The chapel seemed to settle back into its unnatural stillness, but the air was different now. Heavy. Darker. The figures lowered their arms, their heads inclined slightly, as if acknowledging some unseen force. They didn't speak. They didn't move. But I couldn't breathe. I couldn't think. The ritual had ended, but the presence remained. And I realized then, with a growing sense of horror, that I hadn't been merely a witness to it. I had been chosen. I had been drawn into whatever force had been summoned here. And there was no going back. The weight of what I had just witnessed sank into my chest, a cold, unrelenting pressure that seemed to crush my very soul. The chapel had fallen silent again, but the air was no longer the same. It felt wrong, as if the very fabric of the space had shifted, restructured itself to trap me here. I could still feel the echoes of that dark presence, like a shadow hanging over my head, suffocating me. My body screamed for me to run, to escape, but my legs felt frozen in place. Every muscle in my body screamed, but my feet refused to obey. I didn't know how much longer I could stand it, how much longer I could bear the crushing weight of the chapel's presence. Panic surged through me, and I forced my legs to move, stumbling backward, away from the altar that had summoned that thing. I turned, desperate to leave. I needed to escape. I had to get out of here. The exit was close, so close, but as I moved toward the door, I felt a strange shift in the air. The hairs on the back of my neck prickled. The walls felt like they were closing in on me. I reached the door. I had seen it just a moment ago, the old wooden door that would lead me back to the outside world. I pulled at the handle, but it didn't budge. I yanked harder, a cold sweat breaking out on my forehead. The door, it wasn't opening. I tugged, then pushed, then slammed my shoulder into it, but it felt as though something was holding it shut from the other side. My heart began to race. The door remained firmly closed. I stepped back, gasping for breath, my pulse thundering in my ears. I looked around frantically. The chapel, it had changed. The walls seemed to have shifted, the angles of the room warping in ways that didn't make sense. The door, the one I had seen just moments before, was now farther away, its outline blending into the shadows, as if it had never existed in the first place. I tried to calm myself, to think rationally, but the fear was overwhelming. I wasn't sure if it was the room itself changing, or if it was something far worse. Was it me changing, my mind bending under the strain of what I had seen? The thought made my head spin. I stumbled backward, my eyes darting around the room, searching for anything familiar. I turned in a circle, panic threatening to overtake me, and that's when I saw it. The pews, the altar, the walls, none of it was in the right place. The chapel, which had once been so familiar, had now twisted into something unrecognizable. It was as though the space itself had turned into a labyrinth, a maze where every corner led back to the same place, every door closed, every path a dead end. The chapel had become a prison. I rushed to the nearest wall, my hands shaking, and ran my palms across the cold stone. It felt smooth, almost too smooth, like it had been recently polished. There was no sign of any window, no trace of the outside world. My stomach twisted with dread. I pressed my ear to the stone, hoping to hear something, anything, that might tell me I was still outside. But there was nothing, only the deafening silence that hung in the air, thick and suffocating. I turned back to the door, now shrouded in shadows, as if mocking me. It was farther away than before, as though the chapel itself had stretched, twisted its insides like some grotesque living thing. I reached for the door again, pulling desperately, but still no movement. The wood didn't creak, didn't budge. It felt as if it had become part of the chapel itself, as though it were no longer just a door but a part of the dark force that had taken hold of this place. I felt my breath quicken, the panic rising like bile in my throat. My thoughts spiraled, colliding in a whirlwind of terror. This couldn't be happening. I wasn't imagining this. The chapel was alive, shifting its form around me. The space itself was no longer obeying the rules of reality. And that presence, I could still feel it, hovering in the air, watching me, pulling at the very edges of my mind. I spun around again, frantically searching for another way out. But the walls were closing in on me. The room was growing smaller, the shadows creeping further into the corners, pressing in from all sides. The dim candlelight, if it could even be called light, flickered and danced, casting long, jagged shadows that seemed to move with a mind of their own, twisting and turning, stretching impossibly far. I felt like I was suffocating, the air becoming thick and stifling, pressing against my chest. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't think. And that's when I realized there was no escape. I reached out, my hand trembling as I ran my fingers over the cold stone of the wall again. It was as if the chapel was now an organic thing, something that was alive and breathing, something that wanted me to stay. My mind raced, spinning with confusion. Had I imagined it? Was I losing my mind? No. The door, it had been there. I had seen it. And yet, it was no longer real. It had become part of the dark presence, something that shifted with the walls, moving with the shadows, never allowing me to leave. This wasn't just a trick of the light. The chapel had taken on a life of its own, and it had no intention of letting me out. The realization hit me like a wave. The fear flooded my chest, and I staggered backward, my head spinning, dizzy with terror. The walls were closing in. The chapel wasn't just a building. It was a trap, a prison, and it had been waiting for me all along. The exit had been an illusion. The walls, the door, none of it was real anymore. I couldn't escape. The darkness around me deepened, swallowing me whole. I couldn't escape it. The chapel haunted my every waking moment, its presence lingering in the corners of my mind, creeping into the shadows of my thoughts. I had tried to forget it, tried to convince myself it was just a nightmare, a trick of the mind, but the memories, they wouldn't fade. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the altar, the dark figures, and heard that bell. It had started simply. The first night after leaving the chapel, I had fallen into a restless sleep, my body exhausted but my mind racing. At first, I thought it was just a bad dream, a strange echo of the terror I had experienced in that cursed place. But then, it started again. Every night, the same dream, the same vision. I would find myself back in the chapel, standing in the middle of that cold, stone floor. The walls pressed in on me, their ancient stones oozing with a darkness that seemed to breathe. The air was thick, suffocating, as if the chapel itself was alive, feeding off my fear. And there, in the distance, I could hear it, the bell. At first, it was faint, a soft, distant ringing that seemed to come from far away, out of reach. But it grew louder, sharper, the sound reverberating in my bones, vibrating through my chest, each toll echoing in my skull like a hammer pounding on an anvil. The bell didn't stop. It never stopped. Each ring was like a call, a summons. And I couldn't escape it. Then, I would turn, desperate to leave, but the door was always just out of reach, vanishing when I tried to move toward it. I would run, try to run, but the bell, that terrible, endless toll, would follow me, growing louder and louder until I could feel it in every inch of my body. The darkness around me would swallow me whole, and I couldn't breathe, couldn't think, couldn't escape. And just when I thought I would be lost forever, the bell would stop. But the silence that followed was far worse. In the silence, I would hear whispers, soft, distant voices, murmuring in a language I couldn't understand. It wasn't until I listened more closely that I realized the voices were calling my name. I would wake in a cold sweat, my heart racing, my body trembling. The room around me would be dark, quiet, too quiet. And for a moment, I would convince myself it was over, that it was just a dream. But then, that feeling would creep in. That presence. The air would thicken, and the weight of something watching me would press down on my chest. I would lie there in the dark, my eyes wide open, staring into the blackness of my room. It felt as though the darkness itself was reaching for me, closing in from all sides. I could almost hear it, the bell. Every night, the dreams came back, and every morning, I would wake, feeling the lingering touch of that fear. It was as if I had been pulled back into the chapel, trapped in the endless cycle of its darkness. I couldn't escape it. I couldn't escape it. I thought I was losing my mind. The dreams felt so real, so vivid, that I could almost feel the cold stone beneath my feet, smell the musty air of the chapel, hear the mournful toll of the bell. And every time I woke up, the feeling that I had been somewhere, someplace dark, someplace wrong, lingered. One night, it was worse than the others. I woke up suddenly, gasping for air, my heart pounding in my chest. The room was pitch black, and I could feel the suffocating weight of the darkness around me. I reached for the lamp beside my bed, my hand shaking, but it wouldn't turn on. The room remained in complete darkness, and panic surged through me. I couldn't see. I couldn't breathe. It was as if the walls had disappeared, and the entire world had dissolved into the void. Then, I heard it. A soft ringing. At first, it was faint, just the barest hint of sound, barely audible over the pounding of my heart. But it grew louder, closer. The bell. That same bell from my dreams. The sound was so real, so sharp, that it sent a chill through my bones. I could hear it as if it were right next to me, as if it were coming from within the walls themselves. The air was thick with the sound, and it seemed to be closing in on me, pulling me deeper into the darkness. I shot up from the bed, my breath coming in shallow gasps. The bell rang again, louder this time, deafening. I stumbled to the door, desperate to escape, but the darkness felt like a physical thing, blocking my path, wrapping around me like a cold, suffocating shroud. And then, just as quickly as it had started, the bell fell silent. The silence was worse than the sound. I stood there, frozen, my body trembling, listening to the nothingness. The absence of sound was deafening, and it felt like the world itself had stopped moving, had stopped existing. I held my breath, waiting for something to happen, but nothing did. The room was still, quiet. But the silence didn't bring comfort. It was as if the bell had stopped, but everything else, the presence, was still there. Watching. Waiting. Biding its time. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was no longer alone. That I had never truly left the chapel, that it had followed me here, into my own home. I backed away from the door, my pulse hammering in my throat. The darkness closed in tighter, and for the first time since this nightmare had begun, I understood. It wasn't over. Not by a long shot. The bell had called me back. And this time, it wasn't going to let me go. Days blurred together in a haze of uncertainty, my mind teetering between the waking world and the terrifying visions that clung to me like shadows. The dreams, no, they felt more like memories now, became more frequent, more vivid. Each night, I was pulled back into that accursed chapel, and each morning, I woke to find myself unable to tell where the nightmare ended and reality began. I couldn't even remember when my visits to the chapel had started again. They had become almost automatic, like the pull of gravity itself. Every day, I would try to convince myself that it was all just a bad dream, that the fear would eventually fade. But it didn't. The lure of the chapel was relentless. No matter how hard I fought it, no matter how many times I told myself to stay away, I always found my feet carrying me back to that cursed place. And every time I went, it felt different. The air inside the chapel was heavier, thicker, as if the darkness had grown stronger, more palpable. The bell, it would ring again, always at the same moment, always at the same intensity, as if it was summoning me. The shadows inside the chapel had begun to take on forms of their own, flickering, shifting figures that I could almost make out but never quite see. I couldn't stop it. I didn't know how to stop it. Each time I left, I was left with a gnawing emptiness, an overwhelming sense that something had changed inside me. But the next day, I would find myself drawn back again. The thought of the chapel was always there, lurking just beneath the surface of my thoughts, like a whisper I couldn't ignore. I tried to talk to people, locals who had lived here their entire lives. Surely, someone had to know what was happening. Someone could explain all of this. But whenever I brought up the chapel, the conversation would suddenly end. The silence that followed was suffocating. People would look away, as if they had never heard of such a place, as if speaking its name aloud might cause something to happen. And yet, I couldn't help but notice the subtle, nervous glances exchanged when I mentioned the chapel. The way they avoided the subject. The way they knew, deep down, that something was wrong. But no one would talk about it. No one would speak of the things they had seen. One afternoon, after yet another restless night spent battling the images of dark figures and ringing bells, I couldn't take it anymore. I had to know the truth. I had to understand what was happening to me. I stood outside the chapel, staring up at the crumbling stone structure. It was late afternoon, and the fading sunlight cast long, eerie shadows across the steps. I felt a familiar pull, an invisible force drawing me toward it, a force I couldn't fight, no matter how hard I tried. My heart pounded in my chest, a dull, rhythmic beat that mirrored the bell that had haunted me for so long. My breath was shallow, my thoughts scattered, but something inside me told me that I had to go in, that I couldn't avoid it any longer. I pushed open the heavy door, the familiar creak of the hinges sending a shiver down my spine. The inside of the chapel was just as it had been before, cold, silent, and filled with that oppressive darkness that seemed to smother everything it touched. The shadows seemed to stretch out, welcoming me, pulling me deeper into the unknown. I stepped inside, and the door slammed shut behind me, the sound of it echoing through the empty space. The bell rang then, as if it had been waiting for my arrival, its deep, resonant tones vibrating in the very walls. But this time, it wasn't just the bell I heard. There were voices too, whispers, faint at first, but growing louder, closer, as if they were coming from the very stone beneath my feet. I walked toward the altar, my steps unsteady, my heart pounding in my chest. I was aware of every sound, every movement in the air around me. I could feel the chapel watching, the air thickening with something I couldn't comprehend, something ancient and malevolent. And the longer I stood there, the more I began to doubt myself. Was this real? Was I really standing here, or was I simply dreaming? The boundaries between reality and nightmare had begun to blur, and I wasn't sure where one ended and the other began. I reached out, touching the cold stone of the altar, and for a moment the room seemed to shift. The shadows seemed to grow taller, darker, their edges sharpening. The whispers grew louder, and I could almost hear the words now, though I couldn't understand them. They were a language I had never heard before, an ancient tongue that sent a cold shiver through my bones. The bell tolled again, and I couldn't tell if it was inside my head or if it was actually ringing, but it didn't matter. It was as if the chapel itself had come alive, as if it was no longer just a place, but a living entity feeding on my fear, feeding on my confusion. And I couldn't escape it. I couldn't tell if this was real, if this was happening now, or if I was simply lost in some endless nightmare. I stumbled back, my heart racing, my breath coming in ragged gasps. I looked around the chapel, but the walls seemed to shift and distort, like the whole place was bending and twisting, playing tricks on my mind. I wasn't sure if I was seeing things, or if the chapel was changing in front of my eyes, reshaping itself, pulling me deeper into its grip. And then, just as I was about to run, the door slammed open behind me. But it wasn't the outside world that I saw. No, it was a different place. A different time. A place I had seen before, in my dreams. The bell tolled again. And I realized I wasn't in control anymore. The more I visited, the more I felt myself slipping into something dark and terrible, something I couldn't explain. It wasn't just curiosity that brought me back to the chapel anymore. It was an uncontrollable need, an obsession, a desire to confront whatever malevolent force had marked me. The boundary between sanity and madness was crumbling, and the pull of that place was stronger than ever. I could feel it taking root inside me, spreading like a poison through my veins. I couldn't think clearly. The bell, the whispers, the shadows, they all had a grip on me, and I couldn't let go. I was no longer just a visitor to the chapel. I was part of it, part of its eternal cycle, tied to its curse. I could no longer stand the helplessness. I had seen the horrors, I had heard the whispers, and I had felt the weight of the presence pressing down on me. But I wasn't going to be its victim any longer. No. It was time for me to fight back. To destroy it. To break the cycle and end whatever it was that had claimed me. I started researching, frenzied, desperate research, combing through every library, every scrap of information I could find about the chapel and its dark history. I tore through dusty old books, handwritten records, forgotten manuscripts. What had once been a peaceful place of worship had been corrupted long ago, a site of sinister rituals, blood sacrifices, and endless suffering. The swarms of whispers in my head seemed to guide me, pushing me toward knowledge I never wanted to know. They spoke in riddles, in languages I didn't understand, but their meaning was clear. The chapel could not be destroyed. It could not be closed. But I couldn't accept that. There had to be a way. I had to find a way to stop it. I found a book, ancient, bound in worn leather, its pages yellowed with age. The ink had faded over the years, but I could still make out the words, "To close the door, one must die. But death will not free you." A chill ran down my spine as I read the words over and over again. I didn't fully understand what it meant, but I could feel the weight of its meaning pressing on my chest. There was no way to destroy the chapel, no way to make it go away, and the thought of that sent me into a frenzy. I had to act. I couldn't wait any longer. I wasn't just going to stop going there. I wasn't going to simply avoid it. No. I was going to end it. I was going to make it pay. The next night, I returned. This time, I was armed, not with weapons, but with rage, with a single, burning purpose. I had made up my mind. I would not leave until the chapel was no more. I would tear it down if I had to. I would do whatever it took to force the door shut, to end this nightmare. I arrived under the cover of darkness. The bell tolled, the haunting sound that had plagued my every step. This time, it felt different. It felt like a warning. But I didn't care. I had come to end this madness. Inside, the air was suffocating, thick with the same oppressive presence that I had grown accustomed to. The shadows shifted, coiling like living things around me. The figures in black, those dark silhouettes that always haunted my peripheral vision, were there again, moving in the distance. They didn't seem to notice me, didn't seem to care. Their eyes, if they had them, were fixed on the altar. I made my way to the altar, my footsteps quick, unsteady, almost frantic. I was so close now, so close to doing something. I wasn't sure what, but it had to be done. There had to be a way to sever this bond, to banish this place from my life once and for all. The air grew colder as I approached, the whispers growing louder in my ears, their voices clawing at my sanity. They were no longer just whispers, they were words, too many to understand, but I could hear the urgency, the fear. They spoke of fates, of endless suffering, of the inevitability of the ritual. But I wasn't going to listen. I wasn't going to be weak. I reached the altar, my breath shallow, my hands trembling as I laid them on the cold stone. The bell tolled again, louder this time, as if it were mocking me. The darkness thickened, and for the first time, I heard something else, a sound, a scraping noise, like something dragging across the stone floor. I turned, and there they were. The figures in black. But they weren't just standing anymore. They were moving toward me. I could feel their eyes on me, though I couldn't see their faces. There was no expression, no humanity in them. Just darkness, just emptiness. And then, I understood. This wasn't a chapel anymore. This was a place of death, a place of sacrifice, and I was the offering. I had come here to destroy it, but I had already been claimed. I had come too far, crossed too many lines, to ever leave. The figures were drawing closer, and I could feel their cold, lifeless presence wrapping around me. I was surrounded. I wanted to scream, to run, to fight. But I knew it was too late. There was no escaping. The darkness had claimed me, just like it had claimed every soul that had ever walked through that door. I closed my eyes, taking one last breath. It was all over. And in that moment, I realized there was no escape. There was only the bell. Only the darkness. I had become part of it. The air grew colder, thick with the stench of decay, as if the very chapel was alive, breathing in the darkness. My heart raced in my chest, but my feet remained rooted to the spot, as if the stone beneath me had become my prison. The bell tolled again, its echo reverberating through my bones. It wasn't just a sound anymore, it was a force, a calling, pulling me deeper into the abyss. I turned slowly, my pulse pounding in my ears. The figures in black were closer now, their forms no longer shifting in the shadows, but solidifying, becoming something more than just mere shapes. As they drew near, I could feel the temperature drop even further, the cold crawling up my spine like icy fingers. They were no longer just faceless silhouettes. I could see them clearly now, at least, I thought I could. Their features were indistinct at first, blurred like a dream fading into the morning light. But as they approached, their forms began to sharpen, and I realized with growing horror who they were. The figures were dressed in the robes of priests, dark and tattered, their faces obscured by the hoods they wore. Their hands, pale and skeletal, reached out as if to pull me toward them. But it wasn't the priests I recognized, it was their eyes. Their eyes were wide open, unblinking, staring straight at me with an intensity that made my blood run cold. I could see the anguish, the fear, the madness in their eyes. But I couldn't look away. I was paralyzed, caught in their gaze. These were the priests who had once served in this chapel. But they weren't alive anymore. The rot in their flesh, the hollow emptiness of their eyes, it was unmistakable. These were not living men, not anymore. They were spirits, bound here by something ancient, something evil, unable to move on, forever tethered to the place of their sins. They weren't just watching me. They were waiting for me to understand, to join them. I stepped backward, my mind a blur of frantic thoughts, but my legs refused to move any faster. The chapel seemed to stretch and twist, the walls warping, bending, closing in on me. It was as if the very space around me had come alive, a sentient, malevolent thing that knew my every thought, my every fear. I couldn't breathe, couldn't think, couldn't escape. The priests moved closer, their skeletal hands now inches from my face. I wanted to scream, to run, but the very air around me seemed to hold me in place. They spoke, their voices low and raspy, a whispering chant that seemed to echo from deep within the earth. The words were foreign, ancient, but I could understand them. I could feel them. "You cannot escape," one of the priests whispered, its voice gravelly and filled with sorrow. "The bell calls you. The bell has called us all. We cannot leave, and neither can you." Another priest stepped forward, and I saw its face, if you could call it a face, twisted and gaunt, skin pulled tight over bone, eyes hollow, empty, yet somehow full of pain. "We are trapped," it hissed, "trapped by the rituals, the blood, the bell. And so shall you be. Forever." The word struck me like a blow. Forever. The thought echoed in my mind, repeating over and over until it felt like my head would explode. These priests had once been men of faith, but now they were just shadows, bound to this place by something unspeakable. They had tried to escape, just as I had. They had tried to break free of the cycle of torment that had consumed them, but it had been futile. The chapel had claimed them, just as it was claiming me now. I tried to scream, but my throat was dry, my voice lost in the oppressive silence. The priests closed in around me, their whispers growing louder until it was all I could hear. They were pressing in on me, forcing me to look at them, forcing me to see what they had become. "You are not the first," one of the priests muttered, its breath cold against my skin. "You will not be the last. The bell calls all those who dare to enter, and those who hear it are never the same again." I felt a sharp pain in my chest, as if the weight of their words was suffocating me. The world around me seemed to spin, and I stumbled backward, but there was no escape. The walls were closing in. The chapel was alive, a living thing, and it was trapping me in its grasp. I tried to tear my gaze away, to look for a way out, but it was no use. The priests were everywhere now, their cold hands reaching for me, their eyes fixed on mine. I couldn't breathe, couldn't think, couldn't move. The darkness had swallowed me whole, and I was drowning in it. Then I felt it, a sudden, intense pressure on my chest, as if something was pushing down on me, holding me in place. The bell tolled again, louder this time, its sound vibrating in my very bones. I felt my body tense, every muscle locked in terror. And then I saw it. Through the darkness, through the fog of my panic, a figure stepped forward, a tall, shadowy shape that towered over me. It wasn't one of the priests. This figure was different. It was more. Its face was hidden, but its presence was undeniable. It was the force that had claimed the priests. The force that had claimed me. The figure raised a hand, and I felt my body jerk as if something invisible had grabbed hold of me. My heart raced, my mind screamed, but I couldn't move. I couldn't escape. The bell rang again, louder, more insistent. And then, just as quickly as it had appeared, the figure was gone, leaving nothing but the suffocating silence in its wake. The priests vanished with it, their forms dissolving into the air like smoke. I was left standing alone in the chapel, breathless, shaken to my core. But I knew that I had just faced something beyond human comprehension, something that had been waiting for me all along. And now, I was trapped. I wasn't leaving. None of us were. The bell would continue to toll, and the chapel would claim more souls, more lives. Forever. I had joined them. I had joined the spirits of the chapel. And there was no going back. The chapel had swallowed me whole. Every breath felt like it was suffocating me, and my heart pounded with the realization that there was no escape. The bell tolled again, its sound echoing through the very marrow of my bones, reverberating deep into the core of my soul. It was as if the bell itself was controlling me, pulling at the strings of my very existence, forcing me into a place where time had no meaning and reality had no hold. The air was thick with the scent of damp wood and rot, the faint, unbearable smell of decay that seemed to cling to every corner of the chapel. The walls, once comforting in their cold stone beauty, now seemed to close in around me. I could feel them pressing in, like a hand squeezing my chest tighter with each passing second. And the whispers. The whispers of the priests, of the spirits that had once walked this place, now reaching out to me, clawing at my mind. "You cannot leave," they whispered, their voices so soft, so insistent. "You are one of us now." I stumbled forward, my legs trembling beneath me, my mind struggling to hold on to any semblance of sanity. I could see the figures again, those dark shapes in the corners of my vision, slowly materializing into the robed priests. Their hollow eyes never left me. Their faces, once human, had become twisted with agony, faces that reflected the torment they had endured, and the torment they now sought to inflict upon me. I had to get out. I had to leave. But the moment I tried to move, to step toward the door, the world seemed to shift. The chapel, the very space around me, seemed to bend and warp. The door that I had seen earlier, the one that had seemed like my only way out, was now an impossible distance away. The walls stretched farther apart, the shadows lengthening, until the chapel seemed infinite, an endless maze of corridors and dark rooms that I could never escape. "Run," I heard my own voice, a weak, broken whisper. But it wasn't my voice. It was a voice I had never heard before, a voice that sounded foreign and hollow, as if it had been dragged from deep within the ground itself. I turned in a desperate attempt to find a way out. My mind spun, and the chapel around me shifted again, as if it was alive, moving, breathing, watching me. I could feel the walls pressing on me, the shadows becoming more solid, more suffocating. The figures in black moved toward me, their eyes burning with an unnatural light. They were closing in, circling me like vultures, their hands reaching, grasping. I tried to push them away, but they were not flesh, not bone. They were something else, something that existed beyond the physical world, beyond what I could comprehend. "Please," I begged, my voice cracking, my hands trembling as I tried to fight them off. "Please, let me go." But the figures didn't listen. They didn't have to. Their presence was enough. The force of their gaze, their unblinking eyes, was enough to strip away my will, to strip away my humanity. It was as if they were pulling me into their void, dragging me into a place where there was no escape, no hope, no light. The darkness closed in tighter, suffocating me, pressing in on all sides. I tried to scream, but the sound was lost, swallowed by the endless silence that hung thick in the air. The chapel had claimed me, just as it had claimed them, the priests, the souls who had come before me, the lost spirits who could never leave. I stumbled backward, my body moving of its own accord, my mind a blur of panic and fear. The bell tolled again, louder this time, and I felt the vibrations in my chest, in my skull, shaking me to my core. The sound was everywhere now, inside me, reverberating through my very being. It was a sound of death, of eternity, of a place beyond the living. It was a sound that said, "You belong here now." I tried to run, but my legs wouldn't move. I reached out for the door, but it was no longer there. It had vanished, melted into the darkness. The chapel was now a living thing, an entity that was both a prison and a tomb. I could feel it tightening around me, closing off any hope of escape. The figures were all around me now, their cold hands on my skin, pulling me deeper into the shadows. Their whispers filled my ears, their voices like a soft chant, like a prayer, but one that offered no salvation. Only doom. "You cannot leave," they whispered again, their voices merging into one. "You are one of us now. Forever." I closed my eyes, trying to block them out, but it was useless. The darkness had already consumed me. The walls had swallowed me whole. And the bell, continued to toll, its sound now a part of me, reverberating in my soul. The chapel had claimed me. There was no escape. The days blurred together, a slow, creeping fog that stole all sense of time. I woke in the same place I had fallen asleep, yet every morning felt like an eternity had passed. The world outside the chapel seemed so distant, as though I had never truly been part of it. My own body felt foreign to me, as though I no longer recognized it, like I was wearing someone else's skin. The weight of it, the emptiness inside, pressed down on me like a suffocating force. It had been weeks, maybe longer, since I had stepped outside. Or maybe it had been days, time had become irrelevant. I would sometimes find myself standing in the middle of my room, unable to recall how I had gotten there or what I had been doing before. Moments slipped through my fingers, vanished as if they had never been there. I knew I wasn't alone. The whispers had become a constant presence in my mind. The chapel was never far from my thoughts, even when I wasn't in it. The bell had long since become a part of me, ringing faintly in the background of my every waking moment. The sound of it didn't stop. It was always there, a reminder, a curse, calling me back to the place I could no longer escape. I tried to resist it. I told myself it was just my mind unraveling, that the fear and the exhaustion were messing with my perception. But deep down, I knew the truth. There was no escaping it. The chapel had claimed me, and now it was erasing my life. Piece by piece. I stumbled through the house, a hollow shell of myself, as if I were merely going through the motions. The walls, once familiar, felt alien now, strange, oppressive. It was as though the very air had thickened, saturated with the presence of something ancient, something waiting. The chapel was always there, its presence lingering just beneath the surface of everything. And then, I would lose time again. I'd look at the clock and find hours had passed, but only minutes seemed to have gone by. Or I would wake in the middle of the night, in a cold sweat, with no memory of how I had gotten back to my bed. I could feel the pull of the chapel, the call of it, tugging at me like a fishing line, drawing me back into the water. The memories of my life before the chapel were fading. The details were blurring. The places, the people, even my own past seemed to be slipping through my fingers like sand. Every time I tried to focus on those memories, they became more distant, more elusive. I no longer knew who I was outside the chapel. I was becoming something else, something shaped by its darkness. I could feel it in the pit of my stomach, that gnawing sense of loss. I had become part of it, part of the curse that bound this place. Every time I thought about trying to leave, about escaping this nightmare, the memories of what happened within those walls would come flooding back. The priests, the rituals, the bell. And the worst part? I could feel myself slowly becoming like them. Like the ones trapped in that cycle forever. It wasn't just the bell anymore. It was my own mind, breaking apart, unraveling the way the chapel had unraveled everything it had touched. I was no longer the person I had been. I was part of the chapel now, a shadow of myself, lost in its endless corridors, never to be free again. The whispers grew louder, more insistent. They weren't just in my head anymore, they were all around me, inside the walls, inside the very air I breathed. "You're one of us now," they would say, their voices low and relentless. "You cannot leave. You will never leave." I wanted to scream, to fight back, but I was too far gone. There was nothing left to hold on to, nothing real outside of this place. My memories were fading, slipping away like the last breath of a dying man. There was no way out. The chapel was inescapable, and its curse had already marked me. I pressed my hands to my face, trying to stop the panic, but it only made it worse. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the dark shapes of the priests, the twisted figures that haunted my every thought. Their faces, their hollow eyes, their whispers, they were inescapable. There was only the chapel now. There was only the bell. And there was only the curse that had taken hold of me. I had become a part of it, as much as I had tried to fight it, as much as I wanted to resist. I was already lost. The bell tolled again, louder this time, and I could feel it in my bones. I could feel it calling me back to the chapel. I couldn't ignore it. I couldn't run. I could feel myself moving toward it, against my will, as if something deep inside me was already gone. And as the sound of the bell filled my ears, I realized there was nothing left. The memories, the life I had known, had all been swallowed by the darkness. There was only the chapel now, and I was never leaving. The visions were growing worse, more vivid, more real. At first, it was just a flicker at the edge of my sight, a shadow moving where there should have been none. But now, they were everywhere, lingering in every corner of my world. The people in black were always there, watching. It wasn't just an occasional glimpse, they were standing in the shadows, following my every step, their dark figures never far from me. The worst part? They didn't feel like strangers. They felt familiar, like I had seen them before. At times, their faces blurred into one indistinguishable mass, but in the moments when their features came into focus, I was struck by the undeniable truth they were the ones from the chapel. The priests. The ones who had performed those cursed rituals. But it wasn't just them anymore. Their faces, twisted, grotesque, their eyes empty, belonged to something far older than human. I could no longer tell if they were real or if they were part of the curse, part of the hallucinations that had begun to claim my mind. Were they ghosts? Were they memories? Or were they something darker? Something that existed beyond death? They would appear when I least expected it, like a whisper on the wind, like a shadow passing too close. Always silent, always watching. Never blinking. I had to force myself to focus. I tried to look away, to remind myself that these were just hallucinations, that this couldn't be real. But when I blinked, they were still there, their faces frozen in a permanent, hollow stare. Sometimes, I could swear they were moving closer, inching toward me with every passing second. I felt like prey in the middle of a predator's gaze. And then the images began to shift. Their faces twisted, became something other than human, something worse. For a split second, I saw their skin stretch tight over their bones, their mouths gaping wide in silent screams. They were the dead, the ones who had perished in the rituals. The ones whose souls had never left the chapel. Their eyes hollowed out, their mouths open in eternal agony. I felt the air grow cold around me, as if something icy and unseen was brushing against my skin. My breath came out in ragged gasps as I tried to pull away, but my legs wouldn't move. It was like I was stuck, frozen in place by the weight of their gaze, as if they were feeding on my fear, drawing strength from my terror. The time loss had become more frequent, but now it felt like it had purpose, like the chapel was warping time itself. I would blink and find myself in a different place, but always surrounded by the same figures. The air was thick with their presence, and their whispers would echo in my ears, their voices growing louder with each passing second. I had no escape. The more I struggled to break free from the trap the chapel had set for me, the more they would appear, their forms becoming clearer, more defined. Sometimes I could even hear them breathing, slow and shallow, like a wind that was trapped in a tomb, unable to escape. Other times, I could almost feel their hands on me, cold and clammy, as if they were reaching out from the shadows to drag me back to the place I couldn't escape. I tried to scream, but no sound came out. I felt myself paralyzed with fear, my own body betraying me. How much longer could I endure this? How much longer before my mind finally snapped under the weight of their presence? Each time I saw them, I could feel my sanity slip further away. It wasn't just the fear anymore, it was the realization that these figures were no longer just images in my head. They were part of me. They were woven into the very fabric of my being, their whispers threading through my thoughts like poison. I could feel their eyes on me, even when I wasn't looking at them, their presence seeping into every corner of my mind, corrupting everything I had once been. I could feel myself growing weaker, both physically and mentally. The chapel was consuming me, just as it had consumed them. And there was nothing I could do to stop it. The bell tolled in the distance, its sound reverberating through my bones. It was like a calling, a summons that reached deep into my soul, dragging me back toward the chapel. But it wasn't just the chapel. It was them. The dead. The ones in black. The ones who had died in the rituals. They were calling me. I tried to shut my eyes, to block it all out, but the images of their faces burned in my mind, searing into me like a brand. I could see them clearly now, their faces twisted in eternal torment, their bodies broken and mangled. They had died in the chapel, and now they were trapped in it, just like I was. They would never leave, and neither would I. The whispers grew louder, more insistent. You are one of us now. I felt the walls of my own mind closing in. There was no escape. The chapel had already taken me. And the dead, the ones in black, they were watching. Always watching. The more I tried to escape, the more it felt like the chapel was inside me, like its presence had burrowed deep into my mind. I could feel it in every shadow, in every creak of the floorboards beneath my feet. It wasn't just the chapel I could sense, it was the weight of its dark history, the presence of the dead priests and their twisted rituals, clinging to me like a second skin. It followed me, unseen, like a phantom that would never leave. I thought I had gotten away. I drove as far as I could, into the heart of the woods, hoping the isolation would offer me some reprieve. But even then, I couldn't escape. The air still carried the same weight, the same oppressive silence that had enveloped the chapel. The trees around me seemed to close in, as though they were part of the same curse. The wind felt wrong, like it carried the same heavy breath of the chapel, whispering its secrets to the forest. And every so often, I could hear the bell ringing softly in the distance, calling me back. I told myself it was impossible. I must have been imagining it. I must have been so deep into the madness that my mind was playing tricks on me. But then I would look around, and the landscape would shift, bend in strange, unnatural ways. The trees seemed to twist, their branches reaching toward me, as if they were trying to pull me back to where I didn't belong. The path ahead became indistinct. The road blurred and then disappeared completely, replaced by unfamiliar terrain I couldn't place. My mind scrambled to make sense of it, but I could feel it. The chapel was here, too. It was here in the very ground beneath my feet, in the trees that seemed to grow like hands, clawing toward the sky. Time had started to lose meaning. Days and hours blended together like oil and water, swirling into an indistinguishable mess. It was as though I had been caught in a loop, a never-ending cycle where each moment dragged me back to the same place, the same nightmarish reality. I would wake up to the same cold silence, to the same crushing weight in my chest, always aware of the chapel, always aware of the bell, even when I wasn't near it. I couldn't tell if it was day or night anymore. The sun barely shone through the clouds, as if the sky itself was covered in a thick, impenetrable haze. And when I looked at the clock, the hands would flicker in and out of existence, as though the passage of time was as fluid as the shadows that clung to me. It was like I was stuck in some kind of temporal distortion, trapped between what had been and what was yet to come. I thought I could feel my sanity slipping. I tried to hold on to the remnants of who I had been, but the more I struggled, the more it felt like I was drowning in it. The chapel's influence was like quicksand. It pulled me deeper every time I tried to fight it, leaving me weaker, more disconnected from the world I had once known. The faces of the priests, the ones who had died in the rituals, began to blur into the very air around me. They were not just in my mind anymore. They were all around me, their eyes following my every move, their mouths stretched in silent, eternal screams. I could see them in the trees, in the reflection of the glass, in the spaces between my own thoughts. They had become part of the landscape, part of the world I was losing touch with. I could feel them reaching out to me. And I couldn't escape. There was no place to run to, no place to hide. The chapel was no longer a building, it was an extension of me, a prison I couldn't break free from, no matter how far I went. I stumbled through the woods, the ground beneath me shifting and changing with every step. My legs felt heavy, as though the earth itself was trying to pull me into it. I reached for the trees for support, but the bark was slick and cold, as if it, too, was part of the curse. It was as if I had never truly left the chapel, as if I had never truly left the darkness behind. The chapel had woven itself into the fabric of my reality, making the very world around me feel like a reflection of its horrors. When I tried to look up, the sky seemed to close in on me, as though the weight of the heavens was pressing down, crushing me under its oppressive gaze. The wind howled, carrying with it faint whispers, voices calling me back to the chapel. It was as though the very fabric of reality was warping, and I couldn't distinguish what was real from what was a hallucination anymore. Every step I took seemed to take me in circles, pulling me back toward the place I had tried so hard to escape. The faces of the dead, those priests who had been lost to the chapel's curse, stared at me from the corners of my vision. Their hollow eyes burned into my soul, accusing me, haunting me. It was as if they had been waiting for me to realize that there was no way out, that I had been a part of this all along. I looked around in panic. There were no roads, no signs. Just the trees, the whispers, and the feeling that the chapel was everywhere, beneath me, inside me, and all around me. I couldn't escape. I couldn't escape. And as I stumbled forward, feeling the weight of eternity press down on me, I realized the awful truth: there was no leaving the chapel. Not for me. Not for anyone. It was a prison that lived inside us all, twisting time, warping space, until there was nothing left but its cold, suffocating grip. It had already taken me. And now, it would never let me go. I could feel it in my bones. It wasn't just the air around me that was changing, it was me. My own body felt different, heavier, as though I were slowly being pulled into something I couldn't escape. The chapel, this cursed place, was no longer just a dark memory. It was becoming a part of me, rooting itself deep within my soul. I could hear its bells, faint at first, but now they echoed in my mind, ringing louder with each passing moment. I couldn't tell if it was real or if it was just the madness taking hold, but I could no longer distinguish the difference. At first, I thought it was a trick of the mind, a hallucination brought on by the constant strain. But then I began to feel the weight of the ritual, the pull of the invisible forces that had once held the priests captive. It wasn't just something I observed anymore. It was something I was becoming a part of. My body would no longer obey me as it once had. The familiar shape of my hands, my face, felt alien to me. I began to move without thinking. At first, it was small things, my hands lifting, my feet shuffling, my head tilting at odd angles. I would catch glimpses of myself in reflections, pale, hollow-eyed, as if I was losing my very essence. The chapel's power was seeping into my every movement, threading itself into the fabric of my being. I couldn't stop it. I didn't even want to. It was as if I had finally come to accept that there was no longer an outside of the chapel, no escape. It was already inside me, and I was becoming a part of its eternal cycle. I tried to speak, but the words didn't feel like my own. The language felt foreign, a guttural murmur that had no meaning, yet carried an undeniable power. The more I tried to speak with my own voice, the more it was overtaken by something else, something dark and ancient. It was as if the voices of the priests, the ones who had once been trapped here, were now speaking through me. Their whispers became louder in my mind, guiding me toward the ritual, pulling me into its orbit. Every step I took seemed to bring me closer to the chapel, no matter how far I ran. It was as if the very ground beneath me was complicit in this madness, pulling me back. The trees blurred around me, their twisted branches no longer offering escape, but instead pushing me toward the chapel, where the figures in black awaited. And I knew they were waiting for me, for this moment. The chapel was not a place. It was a curse. A curse that didn't exist outside of time, outside of space. It was everywhere and nowhere, and I had become part of it. There was no more me. There was only the ritual, and I was becoming just another soul to feed it. I could feel my body responding, no longer my own, but an instrument of something older, something more powerful. The coldness of the stone floors, the chill of the air, the sharp smell of incense, all of it seeped into me, becoming my breath, my heartbeat. I felt my legs move forward of their own accord, my feet leading me toward the chapel. I didn't need to think anymore. The chapel had already taken over. I could see the figures in black now, their faces hidden in the darkness. They were standing still, their movements synchronizing with mine, their bodies swaying in time with the bell's toll. I knew then that I wasn't meant to escape. I was meant to join them, to become a part of the endless procession of souls that the chapel had claimed. I could feel the cold stone of the chapel's walls, their surface rough against my skin. The heavy scent of incense was choking me, but it felt familiar, comforting, even. It was no longer just the smell of decay and death. It was the smell of belonging, of becoming something greater, something more powerful than I had ever imagined. I knew, with a sickening certainty, that this was where I was meant to be. The figures in black stepped aside, their eyes empty but expectant. They reached for me, their hands cold as they touched my arms, pulling me into the circle. There was no resistance in me anymore. I was already a part of the ritual, a piece of the machinery that kept this curse alive. My own hands moved without my will, raised to the air in unison with the others as the chanting began. It was as if the world outside had ceased to exist. Time no longer passed in seconds or minutes. It had become a single, endless moment, a moment that had existed long before me and would continue long after. I was no longer a person. I was just a vessel, a soul that had been lost to the chapel and its eternal rites. The bell tolled again, a deep, resonant sound that vibrated through my very bones. And I knew, in that moment, that this was where I would remain, trapped, forever a part of the ritual, forever one with the chapel. I had become part of the curse. And now, there was no turning back. The realization hit me slowly, like the creeping chill of an endless winter, until it was all-consuming. I could no longer deny it. I wasn't just trapped in the chapel, I had become part of it. The very walls that had once seemed like barriers now felt like extensions of my body. The air around me grew thicker, heavier, and each breath felt both suffocating and liberating, as if I were inhaling the very essence of the place. I tried to move, but my body no longer obeyed me. Every step was drawn toward the altar, like some cruel force guiding me toward my inevitable fate. It wasn't just the physical sensation that chained me. It was the voices. They whispered softly at first, just a murmur, a cold wind through the darkness. But as the seconds bled into minutes and the minutes into hours, the voices grew louder. At first, they were only faint echoes of the priests who had once stood here, but now they were distinct, clear. Their words were ancient, filled with sorrow, despair, and an unearthly purpose. And as I listened, my mind began to unravel. I understood now. The priests had never left. They were here, in the chapel, bound to it by their rituals, their dark practices. Their souls, their very essences, had been merged with this place, forever entwined in an eternal loop of worship and sacrifice. The chapel was not just a building, it was a vessel, a tomb, a prison that held them captive. And now, I too was becoming part of that prison. It felt as though my very being was fading, slipping away like sand through a clenched fist. My thoughts, once clear and sharp, began to blur into the voices of the priests. I tried to hold on to myself, to cling to the fragments of my identity, but they slipped through my fingers. The more I resisted, the more I became entwined with them. Their memories, their pain, their endless suffering became mine. Their identities merged with mine, and in that moment, I no longer knew where I began and where they ended. The chapel, the figures in black, the bell, they were all part of me now. I could feel their presence inside my own thoughts, their eyes watching through my own. I was no longer separate from them. The ritual had claimed me, just as it had claimed the priests before me. The boundaries between us had dissolved, and there was only the darkness, the bell, and the unending cycle of the ritual. I wanted to scream, to fight, but my voice was no longer mine. It was the voices of the lost, the voices of the damned, all of us bound to this place, to this curse. There was no escape. Not for me. Not for anyone. The chapel had taken me into its fold, and now I was one with it. I had become the very thing I had feared, the thing I had tried to run from. I tried to force myself to remember the world outside, to cling to any trace of who I had once been, but it was slipping away like a distant memory. My thoughts were no longer my own. The priests' chants, their prayers, their curses had invaded my mind, and I could feel myself becoming like them, forever tethered to the chapel, to the ritual, to the endless cycle of darkness. I could see their faces now, the priests, their hollow eyes staring at me from the shadows. They were not just ghosts. They were me, and I was them. I felt their cold fingers brushing against my skin, their breath on the back of my neck. They were guiding me now, teaching me the words, the rites, the steps of the ritual. I could hear their whispers in my mind, urging me to join them completely. And then, as the bell tolled again, I understood. This was my fate. I was no longer a visitor in the chapel. I was no longer an outsider. I was one of them. The spirits of the priests, the souls bound to the chapel for eternity, had merged with mine. And I, too, would remain here forever, lost in the endless cycle of the ritual, caught in the never-ending grip of the chapel's curse. There was no escape. I could not leave. I had become part of the blood-stained chapel in Tennessee, and it would never let me go. I tried to break free. The desire to escape, to scream my warning to the world, consumed me. I needed someone, anyone, who could understand what was happening to me. I couldn't be the only one who felt it, the presence that had taken root deep inside me, the shadow that followed me wherever I went. I had to find a way out. The first place I went was to the local sheriff's office. It felt like a small-town refuge, a place where the mundane and the bizarre could coexist. But as soon as I began telling my story, I knew it was a mistake. The deputy behind the desk looked at me with a raised eyebrow, his gaze growing more dismissive with each word I spoke. "The chapel? You mean that old place up in the hills?" he asked, almost bored. "It's been abandoned for years, man. Folks around here don't talk about it much, but there ain't nothing weird going on. Just local legend, you know? You've been watching too many horror movies or something." I felt a cold chill run down my spine. It wasn't just his words, it was the way he spoke, as if he knew more than he was letting on. But I pressed on, desperate for someone to believe me. "I'm telling you, something is there. The bell rings even when it's locked up, and the figures I saw inside, they weren't just shadows. They were real. And the more I go there, the more I lose myself to it. I can feel it creeping into my mind." The deputy chuckled and shook his head, clearly writing me off as another delusional visitor. "Look, I don't know what you saw, but there's no use getting worked up over it. People in these parts know to stay away from places like that. Ain't no curse, just an old building with a lot of stories built up around it. You're welcome to keep chasing ghosts, but I'd suggest you take a break and get some rest." I stood there, staring at him. His words were meant to comfort, but they only made the weight on my chest heavier. How could they not see? How could they not feel it? I wanted to shout, to tell him that the very fabric of reality was unraveling, that the chapel was alive, that it was reaching out to consume anyone who got too close. But all that came out was a hollow laugh, a bitter realization that no one would believe me. I turned to leave, but as I did, the door swung open behind me. I thought I heard a voice, my voice, whispering my name, low and insistent. The sound of it, so familiar and yet wrong, made my heart race. I spun around, but the deputy was still sitting at his desk, his expression unchanged. I shook my head, the tension in my chest rising. Maybe it was just my mind playing tricks on me. But as I walked out the door, I knew deep down that I was alone. No one would help me. No one could. I was becoming one of the stories, one of the rumors, just another victim of the Blood Chapel. And no matter how many times I tried to explain it to others, I could already feel the weight of the chapel's curse tightening around my neck. As I walked back into the street, the air felt heavier than before. The sound of the bell echoed in my mind, louder now. The shadows were waiting. The days blurred together in a haze of confusion and dread. I could no longer tell where the waking world ended and the nightmare began. Each time I closed my eyes, I saw the chapel. It was as if it followed me, its presence never far behind. The walls that had once felt solid now seemed to shift with every step I took, bending and twisting, leaving me unsure of where I was. I tried to fight it, tried to convince myself it was just stress, just the pressure of everything closing in. But deep down, I knew the truth. My mind was breaking. The lines between what was real and what was conjured from the dark corners of my mind had long since disappeared. I would wake in the middle of the night, hearing the bells, their haunting ring cutting through the silence of my room. I could feel the weight of the shadows pressing against my skin, their cold fingers tracing my spine. They were always there, even when I tried to escape them. No matter where I went, I felt them lurking just beyond the edge of my vision. I would be walking down the street, and suddenly, I'd see a figure in black standing in the distance, just out of reach. They never moved. They just watched. The moment I blinked, they would vanish, leaving me questioning whether I'd seen them at all. But deep down, I knew they were real. They had to be. These shadows were the ones from the chapel, their silent, unblinking eyes staring into my soul. I tried to talk to people, anyone. I went back to the town, looking for someone who might help me, someone who might understand. But all I found were empty stares and polite dismissals. The more I tried to explain, the more distant everyone became. It felt like I was slipping through the cracks, like the world around me was fading, becoming part of the fog I was drowning in. Sometimes, I'd look into a mirror and not recognize the face staring back at me. The reflection was wrong. There was something hollow in my eyes, something that didn't belong. My skin felt like it wasn't mine, my body moving as if on autopilot, disconnected from my thoughts. I would scream at the mirror, trying to force myself to remember who I was, but the voice that came out wasn't mine. It was one of them, one of the priests, one of the lost souls bound to that wretched chapel. I tried to hold on to something, anything, to anchor myself in reality. But the more I clung to it, the more it slipped away. Time no longer made sense. One minute, I'd be standing outside, the sun bright and clear. The next, I'd be back in the chapel, its cold walls pressing in around me. The bell would toll, and the darkness would rise, swallowing me whole. I tried to run, but my legs wouldn't move. The more I fought, the more I could feel my body becoming part of the chapel, becoming part of the ritual that had already claimed so many before me. I didn't know what was real anymore. Was I awake now? Was this moment happening, or was I still trapped in some twisted dream? Every moment felt like it was slipping away from me, like my very sense of self was dissolving into the darkness. I couldn't trust my own thoughts. I didn't know if I was hearing voices from the world around me or if they were coming from inside my head, the whispers of the priests urging me to join them. I had become one with the shadows, just like them. I could feel their cold breath on my neck, their hands reaching for me, pulling me back toward the chapel, toward the eternal ritual that would never end. I was losing myself, piece by piece, and I couldn't stop it. The more I tried to grasp onto my sanity, the more it slipped through my fingers, leaving me stranded in a world I could no longer comprehend. It was then that I saw it, the shadow standing before me, tall and dark, its features obscured by the darkness. The bell tolled once more, and I knew it was calling me. I reached out, my hand trembling, and as my fingers brushed against the shadow, I felt a surge of coldness, a deep, penetrating cold that seemed to freeze my very soul. It wasn't a shadow anymore. It was them. It was the priests. It was the chapel. And there was no way out. I had thought I was fighting it. I believed that if I could just hold on, just stay sane, I could find my way out of the nightmare. But each day, it became clearer. The truth was unfolding like the slow, inevitable unraveling of a thread from an old garment. I wasn't escaping the chapel. I was becoming a part of it. The realization hit me all at once, like a hammer to the skull. I was no longer separate from the ritual. I was inside it. The line between myself and the darkness was gone, eroded by the constant presence of the bell, the shadowy figures, and the endless loop of terror. Every time I thought I could leave, it followed me. Every time I tried to pull away, the chains tightened. I began to see it in the smallest moments, the subtle changes in the world around me. People's faces started to blur when I looked at them, their expressions twisting into masks of horror before fading into a backdrop of darkness. The familiar streets of the town were no longer the same. They felt warped, distorted, like I was walking through a dream. The trees, the buildings, even the air itself, shifted as if the very fabric of reality had been stretched and was beginning to tear apart at the edges. I walked down the road one morning, trying to find some trace of normality, when I saw a figure in black standing at the end of the street. I froze. It was like looking at myself, my own reflection, but wrong. This shadowy version of me didn't move like a person. It glided, silent and fluid, like a wisp of smoke. And yet, I could feel its eyes on me, hollow and hungry, just like the priests in the chapel. I stumbled backward, my heart racing. I tried to blink, to make it disappear, but it didn't. It stayed. A cold wave of understanding washed over me. I wasn't seeing things, I was becoming one of them. I was becoming just another shadow in the ritual, another lost soul bound to that cursed chapel. The more I resisted, the more it consumed me. I would try to look away, to run, but it was like the world was spinning out of my control. I would close my eyes, hoping to escape, but when I opened them again, I was back inside the chapel. The walls pressed in closer now, their oppressive weight threatening to crush me. The figures in black moved around me, their motions slow and deliberate, as if they were waiting for me to understand. Each time the bell tolled, I felt my body tighten, my senses grow numb. The sound was no longer just a sound, it was a signal, a calling. I could feel my consciousness being pulled toward it, like a moth to the flame. I was no longer just hearing the bell, I was becoming the bell. I was becoming part of the rapture, the ritual that had claimed so many before me. My body wasn't mine anymore. It was theirs. I could feel the shift, the cold tendrils of the chapel creeping into my veins, twisting my flesh, until I was more like them than I was like myself. I could no longer feel the distinction between what had been me and what I was becoming. I had lost myself in the rhythm of the bell, the movement of the figures, the endless cycle of worship and death. My thoughts were no longer my own. They were their thoughts, the priest's thoughts, the spirits of the lost souls whose fate I had sealed by stepping into that cursed place. I tried to scream, to pull myself free from the abyss, but no sound came out. The more I fought, the more I could feel myself being drawn into the ritual. It was inevitable. There was no going back. I had become a part of something much larger, much darker than I could ever have imagined. The chapel had claimed me, body and soul. And as I stood there, trembling, I knew I would never leave. This wasn't just a haunting. It was a transformation. The chapel had chosen me, just as it had chosen them, the priests, the victims, the shadows. We were all bound to the same cycle, cursed to repeat the same horrific ritual, forever. The realization hit me like a tidal wave, crashing through my mind with the force of something unstoppable. I wasn't just trapped. I was caught in an eternal cycle, one that stretched back long before me and would continue long after I was gone. The bell, the figures in black, the ritual, it was all part of a never-ending loop, a fate sealed in blood and darkness. And now, I was its unwilling participant. I could feel my body moving as if on its own. My fingers twitched, my feet shuffled, as if the chapel, the shadows, the ritual itself had taken control. I didn't want this. I didn't want to be a part of it. But I knew now, I already was. And the more I resisted, the stronger it became, pulling me deeper into its grip, drawing me closer to the center of the ritual, where the bell would toll and the darkness would rise. I had to find a way out. I had to break the cycle. With every fiber of my being, I fought against the pull, against the growing inevitability that gripped my very soul. I couldn't let this happen. I wouldn't. There had to be a way to stop it, to make it end. There had to be a crack in the wall of this twisted reality, some weakness, some way to destroy the ritual. I started to search the chapel, moving through the cold stone hallways, my heart pounding in my chest. The figures in black watched me, their hollow eyes following my every move. Their silence was suffocating, as though they were waiting for me to find the answer, to find the key that would release us all. But the more I searched, the more I felt the chapel closing in around me. The walls seemed to bend and shift, warping and distorting as though the very space itself was alive, reacting to my presence. It was as if the chapel was trying to swallow me whole, to consume me into its eternal cycle, to make me part of its unending darkness. I could hear the bell ringing again, that deep, resonant sound echoing through the halls. The rhythm of it. The pull. It was a call to join them, a call I could feel deep in my bones, calling me to give in. But I resisted. I had to resist. I had to find a way to destroy it, to make it stop. Then, I saw it. At the far end of the chapel, hidden behind the altar, was an inscription. Faded and worn, but still legible. It was an ancient symbol, one I had seen before in the old records I had found in the town. A symbol of binding, of ritualistic power, and of release. The words surrounding it were strange, foreign, but the meaning was clear. This was the key. This was how the ritual was sustained. This was how the cycle could be broken. I reached out to touch the symbol, my fingers trembling as I brushed against the cold stone. The moment I did, a surge of energy shot through me. It felt like my very soul was being torn apart. The shadows screamed, the bell tolled louder, and the figures in black began to move, slowly at first, then faster, rushing toward me, their eyes burning with fury. I tried to push through the pain, to concentrate on the symbol, to understand how to reverse it. I focused on the words, desperate to remember them, to find the power to stop this nightmare. The coldness of the chapel was suffocating now, and I could feel my body weakening, the darkness threatening to swallow me whole. But then, something inside me snapped. In that moment, I realized that the key wasn't just in the symbol or the ritual. It was in me. I had already become part of it. To stop it, I had to let go. I had to destroy myself within the cycle. To break the chain, I had to make the ultimate sacrifice. With one final, desperate breath, I whispered the words from the inscription. The moment they left my lips, the world around me shattered. The bell stopped. The shadows froze. The figures in black, the priests, their spirits, all of them turned toward me in shock, their forms flickering as the ritual came to a halt. And for one brief, fleeting moment, I was free. The chapel, the darkness, the endless cycle, all of it was gone. It was as though the very fabric of reality had torn itself apart, releasing me from its grip. But I wasn't truly free. I had severed the cycle, but at what cost? My body, my soul, my very existence had become part of the chapel. I had destroyed myself to stop it, to break the chain. I don't know how long I stood there in the silence, the echoes of the bell fading into nothingness. But when I looked down, I could see it, the shadows. They were no longer dark figures in the distance. They were me. I was the shadow, the echo, the one who had ended the curse by becoming it. And as I faded into the blackness, I knew this was my fate now. I would remain forever part of the chapel, forever trapped in this cycle, until someone else would come to take my place. The bell tolled again. I could hear the bell ringing once more, but this time it was distant, fading as though it were an echo from another time, another place. It was quiet, almost peaceful, and in that moment, a sliver of hope flickered within me. For the first time since stepping into this cursed chapel, I felt like I might escape. Maybe I had found a way out. I ran. I didn't stop to think, didn't question my decision. I sprinted down the narrow hallway, my breath ragged, my mind a blur. The shadows seemed to retreat, fading as though the chapel itself was releasing its grip on me. I reached the door, the one I had come through just moments ago, and flung it open. The outside world greeted me with the cool, night air, fresh and untainted. I had made it. I was free. But then, as I stepped across the threshold, the door slammed shut behind me with a deafening crash. I froze, the sound reverberating in my bones. I spun around, my pulse racing, expecting to see the chapel's dark walls looming behind me. But there was nothing, only the night. The chapel was gone. I was standing in a clearing, the trees swaying gently in the wind, the moon shining brightly above. No ominous bell, no distant chants. Just silence. For a moment, I thought I had truly escaped. I thought the horrors, the figures in black, the endless ritual, they were all behind me, vanishing with the night. But then, something shifted. I felt it, a cold, creeping sensation slithering down my spine. A tugging force, subtle at first, but growing stronger with each passing second. My body was no longer mine to control. It was as though invisible hands were pulling me back toward the chapel, toward that place of unholy darkness. The trees around me twisted and warped, bending toward me like twisted fingers, reaching, clawing at the air. The ground beneath my feet seemed to crack and warp, and the night sky flickered, as though reality itself was flickering like a broken film reel. The air grew thick, heavy, as though the very atmosphere was conspiring against my escape. My feet lifted from the ground, as though gravity itself had lost its hold. I gasped for breath, my limbs flailing, but no matter how hard I struggled, I was being drawn back, pulled by an invisible force that I couldn't escape. I reached out in desperation, grabbing onto the nearest tree, trying to anchor myself to the world I thought I had left behind. But the branches were brittle, and my fingers slipped. I was being sucked back into the void, into the very heart of the curse. I screamed, but my voice was swallowed by the wind, lost in the infinite expanse of darkness that had begun to surround me. I could see it now, the chapel, its doors wide open, waiting. The bell's tolling was no longer distant. It was loud, relentless, as if calling me back to my fate. I couldn't stop it. My body was no longer mine. My soul was already part of the ritual, and now it was calling me home. I couldn't escape. I wasn't meant to escape. With one final, hopeless cry, I was pulled through the air, my feet leaving the ground completely. I felt myself being torn apart, sucked back into the abyss of the chapel, where the shadows would consume me once more. The last thing I heard before everything went black was the bell, ringing louder than ever. And then, silence. I had come back. I couldn't remember how long it had been. Time had become an abstract concept, slipping through my fingers like grains of sand. It felt as though I had been in this place, this thing, for eternity, and yet every moment felt like a new beginning. The chapel had become my prison, and the bell, the dark ritual, the shadows, they were my reality now. I couldn't remember what had come before. The world outside, the people I once knew, all of it seemed like a fading dream, something I had only imagined. My body no longer obeyed me. I wasn't sure if it was mine anymore. I was part of the chapel, part of its endless cycle. The walls around me seemed to close in, their oppressive weight pushing against my mind, against my very essence. I walked through the same hallways, the same rooms, the same darkness. The figures in black stood in their places, silent, watching. Their eyes, empty, lifeless, followed me wherever I went, but they no longer terrified me. I had become one of them. I was just another shadow, another lost soul bound to this place. The chapel had no beginning and no end. No matter how many times I turned down a hallway, no matter how many doors I opened, I always ended up back in the same room. The altar. The bell. The black-robed figures, frozen in their eternal ritual. It was as though reality itself had warped, leaving me trapped in an endless loop, a cycle that could never be broken. I had tried, at first. I had tried to find a way out, to escape, to stop it. But now, I didn't even know if I wanted to anymore. The hunger, the thirst for freedom, had faded long ago. There was nothing left to fight for. The bell rang, and I felt my mind, my soul, bend in response to its tolling. It was the pulse of this place, the heart that kept the darkness alive. I walked through the shadows, my steps mechanical, like those of the figures who surrounded me. I could feel their eyes on me, though I couldn't tell if they were real, if they were even alive. They were a part of me now, as much as I was a part of them. I reached the altar again. The cold stone was familiar, the symbols carved into it almost comforting. This was where it all began. The place where I had first seen the ritual, first understood that I was now part of it. And now, it was the only place I knew. The bell rang once more, the sound vibrating through my very bones. I closed my eyes and let it wash over me, the deafening toll filling every inch of my being. The figures in black began to move again, but this time I didn't fear them. I didn't fight them. I was one of them now. There was no escape, no turning back. I had become part of the chapel, and the chapel would never let me go. As I stood there, surrounded by the darkness, I understood. I wasn't just a victim. I wasn't just someone who had stumbled upon the cursed chapel and had been consumed by it. I was the ritual. I was the curse. And now, I would continue it forever, with every soul that would come after me, just as the ones before me had. The bell tolled again, louder this time, and I knew that this was my fate. My existence, my identity, had been swallowed whole. The chapel had claimed me, and I would remain part of its eternal darkness for all of eternity. There was no escape. There never had been. And as the bell's final toll echoed through the void, I faded into it, lost forever. It was no longer clear where I ended and the others began. The walls of the chapel had dissolved, leaving nothing but a vast, endless dark space where time itself seemed to lose meaning. I no longer felt my body as I once had, no pulse, no breath, no warmth. There was only a cold, endless presence stretching across me, inside me. I had become a part of the chapel, a part of the shadows. I couldn't remember what it was like to be me anymore. My name, my life before this place, had vanished into the void. I was just a fragment of the greater whole, a piece in a puzzle that had no edges, no boundaries. My thoughts weren't my own, they were shared, overlapping with the memories of the others who had walked through these cursed halls. They whispered through my mind, their voices indistinguishable from my own. I saw them now, faces, pale and lifeless, their eyes empty but pleading. The ones who had come before me. Their bodies were still, frozen in their eternal positions, as though they had never moved, never left the ritual. They were part of the chapel too, bound to it just as I was, trapped in the endless cycle of torment. I reached out, but my hand wasn't my own. It was as though 1,000 hands reached out with me, all desperate, all grasping at the same hopeless fate. We were all the same now, souls lost, memories fragmented, our bodies and minds forever merged with the darkness that ruled this place. I could feel it, the ritual pulsing through me, its rhythm like a beating heart, slow and methodical. The bell tolling, each ring sending tremors through my being, resonating in the deepest corners of my soul. I had become the bell, the altar, the very walls of the chapel. Every toll, every breath, every movement of the shadows, I was part of it. I was part of them. The figures in black, the priests who had once conducted the rites, surrounded me, but they weren't just figures anymore. They were memories, fragments of people who had been consumed by the chapel just as I had. I saw their faces, their eyes, so familiar, yet so foreign. They had been here before me, and now I was one of them. I could feel their hands on me, pulling me further into the ritual, guiding me, teaching me the steps I had once tried to resist. There was no pain, only numbness. No terror, only an all-encompassing acceptance of my fate. I was no longer a person. I was part of the chapel, part of the curse that would never end. The line between the living and the dead had blurred, and I had crossed it without even realizing. The chapel had claimed me, and now it claimed us all, those who had come before, those who would come after. We were all bound by the same fate, victims and perpetrators alike. Trapped in an endless loop of suffering, of ritual, of darkness. The bell tolled once more, but now I understood it was not just a sound. It was the pulse of the curse. It was the heartbeat of the chapel. And I was part of it. Forever. As I merged with the others, my body and soul dissipating into the darkness, I realized with a final, dreadful clarity the chapel was eternal. And so were we. The cycle would never end. The curse would never be broken. And I, along with the others, would live on, forever lost in the shadows, forever part of the chapel. The darkness around me pressed in, thick and suffocating, until I could no longer tell where the chapel ended and I began. I was surrounded by it now, the memories, the figures, the shadows. They weren't separate from me anymore, they were me. I could feel them, hear them, their whispers curling around my mind like vines, suffocating any shred of individuality I had left. Their voices were quiet at first, barely audible, but then they began to merge with my own thoughts, drowning out everything else. Is this what I am now? I thought. The question was pointless, though. I already knew the answer. It was the same question that had plagued me since the first night, the first time I'd set foot in this accursed place. What am I? The answer was clearer now. I wasn't a man, a person. I wasn't even alive in the way I had once understood life. I was a fragment of something much older, something darker. The chapel, the ritual, had consumed me, and in doing so, I had ceased to be. There was no return. There was no escape. There is no way out, is there? The words left my mind before I could stop them, but they weren't mine anymore. They were the voices of the others who had been here before me. They were me. And yet, I wasn't them. I wasn't anyone. I felt a strange calm wash over me. Not relief, not peace, but an eerie sense of acceptance, as though all the fear, all the rage I had carried with me had burned away. I had fought so hard to understand, to escape, to preserve something of myself. But now, it all seemed so distant, so unimportant. What had been me was gone, and what remained was nothing. It's over, I whispered aloud to myself, though the words felt foreign on my tongue. It was over the moment I stepped inside. The realization was sharp, cutting through the remnants of my mind like a blade. The bell tolled again, louder now, deafening. I could feel it vibrating through every part of me, through my bones, through my very soul. But it didn't matter. Nothing mattered. I tried to remember my name, who I had been before this. But the harder I tried, the more it slipped away. The memories were there, like half-formed images in the fog, but they were vanishing, becoming indistinguishable from the ones that had come before. Names, faces, moments, they all bled into the endless sea of darkness around me. I was alive once, I thought. I was someone. But no more. The irony of it hit me all at once. I had fought, I had resisted, and in doing so, I had become exactly what I feared. There would be no more struggle. No more hope. Only the ritual, the endless cycle. And I would be a part of it. Forever. I'm not alive anymore, I whispered to the dark, the words barely audible. But even as I spoke, I knew they were true. I had become nothing more than an echo, a faint memory of something that had once been real. The figures around me, the priests, the others, they were all part of the same never-ending nightmare. And now, so was I. The chapel had claimed me. My body, my mind, my soul, they belonged to it now. I was no longer a man. I was nothing. I was a shadow. The bell rang again, and this time I didn't resist. I didn't fight. I simply accepted the truth. I had ceased to exist as I had once known it. And in the darkness, I was swallowed whole. The bell rang again, louder now, as though the sound itself was tearing through the very fabric of my being. Each toll reverberated inside me, shaking the remnants of my soul. There was no escaping it. There was no avoiding the truth anymore. The darkness, the chapel, the ritual, everything had become one in me. I could no longer distinguish between myself and the cursed place I had wandered into all those nights ago. It was all so clear now. The struggle, the resistance, the confusion, it had all been pointless. Every attempt to flee, Every time I had tried to understand had only drawn me deeper into the web. The chapel had been waiting for me, always. It had been here long before I arrived, and it would remain long after I was gone, if such a thing could even be said about me anymore. I felt a deep, suffocating pressure in my chest, as though the walls of the chapel themselves were closing in around me. My breath quickened, my pulse racing, but it didn't matter. There was nowhere here, no escape, no distance to run. There was only this endless, unyielding presence, and I was part of it now. Every part of me. It's not over, I thought, though the words seemed futile in my mind. It's never over. I could feel the presence of the others now, the spirits who had been trapped here long before me. Their cold, empty eyes pressed into mine, their voices blending with my thoughts. I no longer feared them. They weren't strangers. They were me. We were the same. All of us trapped in this endless cycle of torment and darkness, bound together by the same invisible force that had consumed us. And then I understood. There was no end. There was no redemption. No salvation. There was only the ritual, the eternal return, the endless repeating of the same horrifying dance. The bell tolled again, and I felt it deep in my chest, as though my very being was vibrating with it. And in that moment, something inside me broke. It wasn't fear. It wasn't panic. It was something else, something darker, deeper, and more profound. It was acceptance. There was no longer any resistance, no desire to fight, to escape. The chapel had consumed me, and in doing so, it had stripped me of everything that made me human. I am the chapel now, I whispered, the words leaving my mouth before I even realized I had spoken them. The realization hit me like a wave crashing over me, and there was no terror in it. Just a cold, detached calm. The figures in black, the priests, they moved around me, and I moved with them now, part of their procession, part of the endless ritual. I was no longer an observer. I was no longer a victim. I was a participant, a cog in the wheel that would turn forever, an unbroken cycle of darkness and death. There was no escape, no light, no hope. There was only the chapel, the ritual, and the tolling of the bell. This is my fate, I thought, though even the thought seemed to fade, swallowed by the darkness. It was no longer even mine to claim. I was nothing. I was no one. I was part of the cycle. And as the bell rang once more, I understood completely. This was my existence now. Forever. The bell tolled one final time. Its deep, resounding chime filled the void, vibrating through every part of me until I couldn't tell where I ended and the chapel began. The air was thick, suffocating, and the shadows, those eternal, creeping shadows, closed in tighter. The figures, the priests, moved in their endless ritual, and I moved with them now, not as an observer, not as a victim, but as one of them. I could feel it, the pull, the weight, the finality of the chapel's embrace. It was as though the very walls were alive, breathing, pulsating around me, pulling me in, suffocating me. Every breath I took was tainted with the musty, ancient scent of decay. The light was gone now, and there was no space, no place where I could stand apart from this nightmare. This is it, I thought, but even those words were a shadow, lost in the darkness. I couldn't remember the world outside, the world before. There was only this place, this moment, this endless loop of despair. I felt myself slipping, my body dissolving into the darkness, becoming one with the chapel. I could hear the whispers now, clearer than ever, their voices merging with my own thoughts, drying out anything that was once human. The others, those lost souls who had come before me, they were no longer strangers, no longer separate from me. They were a part of me now, as I was a part of them. We were all bound together, locked in this endless ritual that would never end. I tried to scream, but no sound came. I tried to fight, to break free, but my body wouldn't obey. It was as if I had no body at all anymore. Only the presence remained, an overwhelming, all-consuming force that was everything and nothing all at once. There was no escape. No light. No future. Only the bell, tolling forever, as I became part of its unholy sound. The walls of the chapel closed in on me, but it wasn't like being trapped. It was like I was being absorbed, becoming part of the very stones, the very air that filled the chapel. The air grew colder, heavier, as I felt myself losing grip on the last thread of who I had been. I could no longer tell if I was alive or dead. My thoughts, my memories, everything that had once been me, began to fade, blending into the endless darkness that surrounded me. And then I understood. There was no escape. The chapel had already claimed me, just as it had claimed all those who had come before. It had consumed me, and in doing so, it had erased me from existence. I was no longer a person. I was a part of the ritual, a part of the cycle that would never end. And so, I was lost. Completely and utterly lost. My identity, my life, gone, swallowed whole by the chapel. I was no longer myself. I was the darkness. I was the ritual. I was the bell. And as the final toll echoed through the infinite void, I realized there would be no end. No release. Only eternity. Forever. Thank you for making our stories part of your relaxation time. We hope they brought you a sense of peace and transported you to a world of fantasy and mystery. If you enjoyed the stories, feel free to leave us a review. Your feedback inspires us and helps us make the content even better. Now, unwind to the calming sounds of rain and thunderstorms, which will continue to set a tranquil mood. Let these sounds carry you gently into the realm of dreams. Don't forget to like our page if you haven't yet. Wishing you a restful night's sleep. Relax, rest well, and good night.